Hello, hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Artisans of Steel. This is a podcast where we talk with some of the most inspirational makers that I know of, who I'm fortunate to know and be friends with, and for them to share their story, their background, their inspirations, and with all of you. And it's a great time, and I just want to say real quick thank you to all the Patreon sponsors and Patreon members. They're the ones that really make this podcast happen. They're the lifeblood that keeps this thing going, and so I really appreciate all of them. If you want to join the Patreon to catch these discussions live, so you can ask questions, become part of the conversation of these interviewees, as well as private Q&As and the private Discord and everything else that's on the Patreon. Go look up Malmasi Fire Arts on Patreon. I also have a link on my Instagram bio, and it'll take you there. You can sign up. You can choose whatever level. At the $15 level, which I believe is the illuminated individual level, and higher, that's where you get to be part of the conversations, the private Q&As, and all that kind of stuff. And so I just want to say thank you to all of them. Real quick, I'm going to roll through all of our super sponsors before we get into today's interview. First off, we have Eric Kidwell. He's at District 202 LLC. I first met him in Arizona at the Travis Wertz Hammer-In. He's the media guy. Basically, he runs around with a camera and like all this electronic equipment around him. And I think I gotta adjust my mic. I'm not sure if I'm being louder. Oh wait, I always forget to check my levels. I crank them up a little bit. Sorry if I was a little bit quiet there. So he's running around the Hammer-In with all these camera and equipment and cords and stuff, and he's capturing video. He's a great guy. He's just getting into his knife making journey, and he's sorry, I'm just getting distracted over here on the side. He's a great dude. He's done a lot to help the knife making community, especially in relationship to the Travis Wertz Hammer-In over the last several years, almost a decade, honestly. And so go check him out, District 202 LLC. He's just getting his journey started, but he's a good guy and a good follow. Next up is Josh A. Weston. Better known as Josh Weston, but he's Josh A. Weston on Instagram. He's also part of the Dragon Forge experience. He comes to knife making from a graphic design background, so he's super creative, very talented. In fact, before I started getting into forging blades myself, I saw one of his, I think it was like a Tumblr post or something like that. If anybody remembers what Tumblr is, blog site. Anyways, he had this great railroad spike tomahawk that he had forged. It was so cool, and so I've been following him for honestly a long time, probably 2012 at least, maybe 2011. And but he's also part of the Dragon Forge experience, which is basically they're fabricating these forges that look like dragons. They have them set up at permanent kind of installations at various Renaissance fairs around the country, where you can go and forge knives with experienced forgers. A lot of the guys, Josh, as well as Richie, and some of the other guys are also Forged and Fire competitors, former Forged and Fire competitors and contestants. They're all great dudes, and they create a really unique opportunity for people to get into forging or try their hand at forging for the first time ever out of the mouth of a fire-breathing dragon. So go check them out, Dragon Forge experience, and see where they're going to be at, so you can get that experience. So next up is Michael Poor. He is Red Dragon Forge. He is a consummate member of all these podcasts. I'm so thankful for him being here as well as being a supporter. He's a local to me. He's actually just north of me, a couple hours here in Washington State. I'm looking forward to getting together with him later at the end of September. And he's just a great guy. He does a lot of work with traditional kind of Japanese knives and Viking kind of swords. Actually, he's working on a Viking sword right now. And I'm excited to see how that comes along. He's also a very talented cook. So I think part of me is also excited to hang out with him for the potential that we might get to eat some of his delicious foods. So go check him out. He's a great guy. Red Dragon Forge on Instagram. Next up, we have Russell Tinsley of Ouzelfinch Beers. He's at his maker page is at Can't Make Knives. He hasn't posted on there in a little while, but that I think that is because his full-time gig is owning a brewery over in Virginia called Ouzel Finch Beers. That's OOZLE Finch Beers. Really great, delicious, out of the box, or like outside of the norm kind of beers, and sours, and kind of what do they call? Kind of dabbling in more of like the alcoholic sodas and stuff like that. And so they do really great stuff. Go to your local beer market, and if they don't already carry it, talk to the purchaser about getting some cases of the Ouzel Finch beers in, because they will guarantee sell. They're really delicious, and the labels are really great. Should be an easy sell as well. But anyways, go check them out. Give him a follow. He's doing really good work, and yeah, go check him out. All right, next up is Dan Hubbs. He's 6'6" Mountain Knives on Instagram and Facebook. He is actually also going to be hanging out with me at the end of September, when I am going to be doing my class. He's based out of Texas. He does really great EDC work. He has a couple he just posted up on his Instagram that are made, I believe, from the Baker Forge and Tool, with the copper mine kind of cladding on the blades. He's getting really great finishes, and they're great little knives. Go check him out. He's a good guy and a good follow. He's doing solid work. Next up is Lawrence Lake. Sorry, I just realized I sniffled into the microphone. I've been dealing with allergies right now, and so I will try to be more conscientious of not snorting and sniffling into the microphone. Apologies. Okay. Next up is Lawrence Lake of Maritime Knife Supply. He's Maritime Knife Supply, both or all three, on Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok. You can also find them online at maritimenifesupply.com. He's based out of Atlantic Canada, which is kind of like the East Coast side of Canada. And they're a supplier of basically anything you need for knife making, from grinders to belts to anvils to handle materials to handle like little pins and all the kind of like tongs and everything, like anything you might need. Steel even. They just got knife bags in, I just noticed. Anything you need for knife making, you can get it from Lawrence Lake. And if he doesn't carry it, he can source it and get it to you. So they don't just ship in the United States. They also, in Canada, they distribute throughout the United States too. And he is on top of it. So go check out Maritime Knife Supply on Instagram, as well as maritimenifesupply.com. All right, next up is Ben Butcher, AMO Bladesmithing. That's AMO Bladesmithing, the love of bladesmithing. Ben has been working on some tons of these little like paring knives and kind of smaller, like petty knives. He's doing really good stuff. He's actually just based out of Portland, a couple hours south of me. And he also is going to be at the class at the end of the month of September. I'm really looking forward to hanging out with him and getting to know him a bit better as well. He's doing great work. He's a solid follow. Go give him a follow and check out what he's been doing. He also does a lot of really cool brute to forge work, where he's forging in kind of what would typically be a compound grind or hollow. He's forging that into his work, and he's one of very few people I think that I'm aware of that are doing that. So go give him a follow. His work is very cool and very interesting. Next up is Gabe Fletcher of Anchorage Brewing. He's on Instagram as at Anchorage Brewing, as well as at Anchorage Forge. So Anchorage Forge is his maker page, where he's showing a lot of his knife work, his knife forging. And he's been doing some really awesome, solid work. I've been fortunate to work with him a couple times over the last, I guess, couple of years now, and he has picked it up and really quickly. And I think it does benefit him that he comes from a background of woodworking and carpentry, and really like working with his hands. He's a very hands-on, kind of crafty person, and so he's picked it up really great. In fact, he's got a hunter right now he's working on. He just sent me a picture, a little sneak peek. He'll probably post it here in the next couple hours, but of one of the knives that he's working on. It's a gift for his father-in-law, and the pattern in that blade looks awesome. It looks so good, and it already looks crazy, and it's only like at a 60 grit finish. I can't wait to see it finished. Also, if you go to your local beer market, if they don't carry Anchorage Brewing beer, tell them to get it in. The Anchorage Brewing beer is some of the best beer I've ever had in my entire life. I love it, and I've been fortunate to work with Gabe to do a couple like private runs, and it's so good. So go check them out. If they got it, then get it. If they don't, ask them to get it in. All right, finally is Tony Sasma, TNT Forge on Instagram. Another great guy. He actually joined us for a Q&A I think that was last month. And so he's doing really great work. He's with his Damascus, as well as his Damascus finishing, his handles finishing, and that's what he joined us for in that Q&A. He's a really great guy, and also another solid follow. He's rebuilding a forge. If you go check out his Instagram right now, he's rebuilding a forge. He's doing the house. I think it's Housemade from Brian House. Housemade forge. Brian House has designed a forge that Tony is now putting together, and he also has one of the Brian House grinders, so he's putting that together and getting everything like souped up and fixed up and cleaned up in the shop. And I'm actually kind of jealous because I have a grinder that could definitely use a paint job, and I don't have the time to make that happen, or at least I probably could find the time. I struggle with being organized, and so I'm inspired by his organization to be able to get that done. So go check out Tony. He's a great guy, and he's doing great work. All right, without further ado, that's all our super sponsors. I want to get into a conversation with my friend, Mr. Don Carlos Andrade. Typically, I think he just goes by Don Andrade, but he's very formally or not formally known as. He's not formally known as anything. That's just a very formal way of introducing him. But Don Carlos, Mr. Don Andrade. I first met you at Blade Show. I believe the first Blade Show I went to was in 2014. And you came out of nowhere. You and Abe, who is the owner of Eating Tools, and both guys are like at least 6'2" or 6'3". I think you're like maybe 6'5". Yeah. And it's like, holy shit, who are these guys? And you guys were both very kind and complimentary of my work. And I had seen your work. I just didn't know who you were. And so it was really great to put a face to the work. And over the years, I've continued to follow you, and we have tons of examples that we'll be able to see on kind of like the video version of this podcast. But a ton of examples of your work, because that really, what I love about your work is it's I don't know how to describe it. It's varied. It's extremely varied, but it's also cohesive at the same time. And I think you found a really great way. And honestly, I think it could be a strong inspiration for a lot of other people to kind of explore their shapes a little bit more in their handle design and their blade profiles without getting crazy, staying functional, making sure the work stays functional, but still exploring within kind of the boundaries that you have to work in. And I think you come from a background of cooking. I think understanding how the tool is supposed to be made helps you to understand where those boundaries are that you can then work within and explore and experiment with. And I think you do that really well. And I've been a fan of your work for a very long time. And I appreciate you coming on and joining us for the show.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you for having me on. And it was a memorable time. The first time we met at Blade. I mean, Blade's always memorable. I mean, it's such a,
unless you drink too much.
It's just such a, yeah.
Sometimes I have a hard time.
That's probably, but not as much as that Vegas show. That Vegas show was like a next level in terms of partying. But
right.
Yeah, that was a good time, and it's always amazing to see as much as you can see at the Blade Show, because there's an awful lot to see. So I appreciate you having me on, and and start the conversation. I mean, I think that really I got into it as a result of being trained as a chef. So I went to culinary school right out of high school, and
oh wow.
And then I grew up camping and backpacking, so I've been using knives really a lot, all my formative years. I think my dad gave me a knife when I was like 6 years old, like a little buck folding knife,
Right.
And my parents were teachers, and they never really dissuaded us from cooking our own food. So I was making food in the kitchen when I was like a little kid, and so I always really loved knives, so it's been having that background has helped a lot. That's for sure. And it took me a while to kind of get there. I spent a lot of time making art for many, many years.
Sure.
But having a background in a lot of different materials, it really helped a lot. I mean, it's a good thing to have a materials background coming into this.
For sure. What kind of mediums before you got into knife making? Because I think, as I understand, you got into knife making maybe in the last 20 years or so.
Yeah, I made my first knife in 2006, so it's been a little over
Oh, wow.
16 years now. Yeah, April
Okay.
2006.
Okay. And so I'm curious, what are some of the mediums that you're working in, and using kind of like as an outlet for your creativity leading up to the knife making?
Yeah, my dad was an industrial arts high school auto shop teacher, so I grew up in a
Oh, cool.
shop, where there was like lathes and drill presses, and it was all auto centric, focus because that's what my dad did, and
Yeah.
and at home, other than being at the beach when I was like an infant with my dad, like the earliest memories was like fetching wrenches for my dad,
Oh,
and
sure.
he'd be under the car and be like, get me, whatever, a half inch, like open end or whatever. I'd be like a little kid crawling around, like getting him wrenches. And, we were all super into bicycles. So, he taught me how to weld when I was really young. And we still
Oh,
just like
cool.
make kooky bicycles. We'd cut apart bikes and put them back together and make these like low rider bicycles and tall bikes. And my dad loved recumbents. So like we were building recumbents, like short wheelbase, long wheelbase. And so we were just cooped out on like surfing and waves and bicycles as kids. Like that's all we cared about. And
Yeah.
so, I remember early on being, like 9 years old, just like going to this night. It was a welding night, an open shop night at the high school where he taught at Culver City High School in Southern California, and just welding these little sculptures. And I didn't even know I was making sculpture, but I was. And, fast forward to, having gone to culinary school, helping open some restaurants around LA, and really feeling like I wanted to go back to school and get,
Mm,
there were a lot of other things I was interested in. I really wanted
right.
to get a university education. And so I went back to school and studied psychology, philosophy, and fine art. And I found at this junior college I was at here, where I'm now living in the Central Coast in San Luis Obispo area, they just had
Right.
a fantastic art department. They had a foundry, and I had done all this
Oh,
stuff with
wow.
metals. I'd fabricated steel and all these things. I was like, wow, casting metal? That's crazy. So I got really, really engaged in casting bronze, and did that for quite some time. That was like my primary medium, along with continually doing some welded sculptures. And I was doing some printmaking along the way too. Did a lot of woodcut, a lot of monotyping, and that kind of thing. That kind of came a little bit more later in college years. But yeah, the bronze casting was a huge. It was just so fun. I mean, I guess if you're a pyro and you like fire, like that's the place to go. So and learning how to run the melt and actually how to do it well, and just all the technical aspects of bronze casting. It's interesting that I haven't really put that together with my knives as much as it's possible. I see guys
Mm,
like Angers Hogstrom and certain guys that are casting like furniture, and
sure.
there's still potential there for sure. And then around the end of my, time in college, right before graduation that last year, the lady that was the sculpture instructor did a Fulbright scholar exchange with a guy from England, and he came out. He was really into stone carving, and I never wanted to carve stone. It just seemed like horrible. Like, why would hit a rock with a chisel and the hammer? And then I got super hooked on it, and I did that.
Right.
So there was some overlap with the bronze and the stone, and there might even be an image I sent you of a piece that's like both. And then I ended up stone carving for a bunch of years and then teaching that.
Oh, wow.
So, and then eventually my former wife and I, we left this area. We went and started a small school for the arts up near Joshua Tree. She's still running it. It's in 29 Palms, called the 29 Palms Creative Center and Gallery. And things were going pretty well. We were teaching some adults, mostly a lot of kids. And one day I just felt like, man, it's been like, almost 19 years of making fine art, spending all this time by myself, and I'm making these purely aesthetic objects. And I thought, there's something else was pulling on me. And I thought, I really wanted to start making work that people engaged with in a different way. Like I noticed when I
Sure.
taught, a lot of younger students stone carving, and, we would do these small sculptures, and the way someone engages with something small that they can pick up is really different than like a big stone carving that just sits there. You can touch it, but you're not really engaging with it in a way where you actually pick it up. And so there was something about things that you can actually pick up, and and I've been studying cutlery for just my whole life, really. And I started looking. I didn't even really know a lot about handmade knives. I mean, I had been collecting a little bit for maybe 8 or 10 years, but I started looking at websites and watching knives just come off and go up and sell, and and I'm sitting on years and years and years worth of sculpture that's not selling.
Oh, right.
I thought, I want to learn to do something different, and that's when I found a mentor, and I found Taigu, and we started working together.
Right. Just kind of get a concept for time frame. When you were a kid and you were doing like building bikes and stuff, one, that must have been super fun, because I think, not to age you, but I think you were growing up at a time where like even the swing bike, I don't know if people know what swing bikes are anymore,
Yeah.
but swing bikes were happening, and it's where like the handlebars, like the middle part of the frame pivoted back at the seat and under the handlebars, and you could do all kinds of crazy moves on it. But I can imagine that was a really like a really fun, uh just like I can being a kid doing that kind of work and building your own bicycles and experimenting with the different shapes and what you can do and where you can add wheels here, and understanding again, like trying to learn where the boundaries are, because you have to have a certain amount of function for it to be able to actually work as a bike. But then once you understand that, then exploring with different shapes and stuff, how great that would have been for just like the development of your creative mind, to be like, all right, now what else can we do?
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
that was happening, and that was when you were like, maybe what you said, 10 or 11?
Yeah. I mean, I was pretty young. Yeah. I was like 9, 10 years old,
And that was it. When was that? In the
Gosh, I'm not super great. I mean, I'm going to be 56 in October in another month here. So, yeah,
Okay.
that was a bunch of years ago.
It was a while ago.
It's just
Okay.
like,
I mean, not forever ago, but
like the
this is
early,
like in the 70s.
yeah, like late 70s, early 80s.
Yeah.
I mean, it was so funny. It was about the same time that all that stuff was happening up on Mount Tam, where those guys were like off-roading these bikes that they were kind of putting together, and we were sort of in a weird way doing some of the similar stuff. We were all super BMX kids, and I rode like a small BMX bike, and then when that Cause Cruiser came out with Mongoose, I got one of the very first ones, and we were
Wow.
racing and building tracks. But then we were also taking 10 speeds and just doing kooky things like jamming the 2x4 into the chainstays and bending it so you could put a fat wheel in like a Schwinn
Oh, right.
Varsity 10 speed. And so it was hilarious because, when I look back at some of the historical things around like mountain biking, we were kind of doing some of that stuff, even in the city. I mean, I grew up in Los Angeles, right near the beach communities, next to LA airport, but there was open land and places to ride. But it was pretty
Wow.
free. It was definitely a different time. I mean, I grew up in the era where parents just were like, whatever, go do whatever you want to do, and we'll see you when the street lights come on, kind of thing.
Right. Well, and that's kind of trying to think of like the time. That's like when like Cannondale and K2 were just being born, right?
Yeah, all those companies like PK Ripper was just starting out. I mean, Mongoose made
Wow.
that leap into like making like
Oh man,
larger
ooh, crazy.
BMX bikes, and it's like, yeah, it was like the really hot time for BMX for sure.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
Which is now like huge again. I didn't even realize I was I was like, man, it'd be fun to have a 26-inch wheel BMX bike. And I went online, started looking around. It is like really big again.
it's massive, especially downhill mountain biking is insane. I'll have to send you some posts that I save posts for my kid on Instagram of really like people doing really interesting stuff or cute animals or whatever, just to kind of like expose them to the wild world around us.
Yeah.
And some of those are downhill mountain biking. Some of them are fucking insane. They're just ripping down a mountain at like 40 miles an hour.
Yeah.
It's pretty wild, but I think that's so. So right out of high school, you went into culinary school. Were
Yeah.
you going to a culinary school down in California?
Yeah, I went to a culinary school in Los Angeles. It was actually a trade school. It was Los
Oh,
Angeles Trade Tech. At the time when I went there, I graduated. I was only 17 years old. I graduated high school in 1985, and I went right into culinary school. And it was because I didn't, my brother and sister graduated college same year I graduated high school. My parents were like, we're kind of tapped. We don't really have the money to send you to college. I was like, that's fine. I kind of thought about, well, what do I like to do? And everyone always seemed to really like my food on Boy Scout outings. So I was like, I'll go learn how to cook.
sure.
Oddly enough, it was either that or fashion design school. And I thought, I'm probably more likely. I would have loved to have done that. I think clothing is fascinating.
Absolutely.
And at the same time, I thought I'm probably more likely to get a job, if I learn how to
Sure.
cook. So I did that, and they were ranked like I think fifth best in the nation at the time. That
Oh,
school
wow.
for community college fees, they were right in there with CIA, Rhode Island,
Right.
Wales. I mean, it's like it was great. I mean, they teach you all the same stuff, so it was an important time in my life. I mean, I'm really, really glad that I did that. It's a skill. I was actually thinking the other morning because I pretty much almost never eat out. I mean, I will, but like
Sure.
once you get the idea of like how
The same
excellent
here.
food can be, or like,
Yeah.
and you know how to make it, I might as well eat at home. It was actually one of those things I thought, if I had to give a young person advice, like life advice, which I generally don't do unsolicited, but if someone
Sure.
asked me, I would say become proficient in the kitchen, like learn how to cook really well, like totally, you would never regret knowing how to
Yeah.
do that. Yeah.
Yeah, and there are more. It's interesting. I've listened to a lot of podcasts and conversations between chefs, and I think that the challenge that a lot of people struggle with is just understanding, like being able to kind of like imagine what different flavors go together well.
Yeah.
That's all. Like, it doesn't even have to be a particular cuisine. If you have lime and tomato and you have chicken, what can you do?
Mhm.
And it's like, and maybe you have like you got a bag of pasta from the Dollar Tree or something.
Yeah, yeah.
And so, like, what can we do? And you can make some pretty simple, tasty, delicious food
It
just
was
with
ama
the
it's
ingredients.
amazing. I mean, especially these days for many people, being able to be smart about food choices, not only for our own health and well-being,
Yeah,
but just for economy and being able to be
right.
frugal. I mean, last night I had a friend come over and she's proficient in the kitchen and, we actually taught health and healing together quite a bit. And she just was like,
Mm,
"Oh, I got all these shiitakes," and like, I normally make my own beans, but I had a can of like pinto beans, and she's like, and some really beautiful sweet Vidalia onions, and she's like, "Oh, I'm gonna saute these onions and do the mushrooms in there." And I thought she was gonna do the beans on the side. She like added the beans to it, and I was like, "That's just weird. Like that just sounds weird." But oddly enough, with like a little bit of like ground thyme and like some other minor spice, I mean, it was like shiitake mushrooms and pinto beans with onion. I mean, it actually was really good, and it surprised me because I thought,
sure.
well, that's the thing, and it is hard, I think, for people that are haven't spent enough time and well, I think people. It was funny, because I would teach health and healing in people's kitchens privately when I kind
Yeah.
of left the desert, came back here, and people would say the same thing that they did when I was teaching stone carving. They were like, "Well, what if I make a mistake?" And I'm like, "I don't know if there really are any mistakes. I mean, if you burn something or if you just like blow it
Mm,
out with spices and it's unedible, that's one thing, but it's pretty hard to totally screw something up."
yeah. And even if you oversalt something, like you potentially could dilute, if you have the ingredients, you could basically dilute it down and
Add
reduce the
more
amount of
stuff.
salt by volume. That's the only time I've really ruined something, or
Mhm.
other than like completely torching it on the
Yeah,
grill or whatever,
yeah,
on the
yeah,
toaster. But is when I oversalt stuff. I'm just like,
yeah.
fuck, I ruined it. Because this is when there's too much salt, it is just completely inedible.
Yeah, it's a hard one to turn around.
I think that's really interesting that you, like, how you used to be, like, do those one-on-ones with people,
Yeah,
and teaching them about health and well-being and cooking and nutrition, I'm sure too, and how that all plays into, just like your overall being as a human. Like,
yeah,
people, I think, unfortunately, like, discount how important nutrition is and that food that we're actually putting into our bodies.
yeah,
And that's something I actually wish I knew. And I mean, I feel like intellectually I understand, and it's part of the reason I do a lot of my own cooking at home, is that the more I cook for myself, the more I know what's going into my body, and how that affects me.
yeah.
But I still don't know it to the depth that I wish or to the, I guess, the level of understanding that I wish I had.
Yeah,
Um,
I mean, there's always more to learn, and it's 100% why I got into knife making. I mean, I found a book on Ayurveda, which is like an
mm,
Indian, like basically like a health and doctoral method of like eating. It's cultural. It's like everything. It's a
sure.
physician based thing, but most people know what it is. But I found a book on Ayurveda when I was in culinary school, and it's funny because as a little kid, like I just always didn't like leftovers, and like I read in
Sure.
there somewhere, they're talking about not eating like old food, and so it kind of helped confirm some of that. And so that's really when I got
Oh,
pretty
interesting.
sparked about reading about health and healing and food and how it relates to you know just living a healthy, vibrant life. And 100% why I started making knives. I was just like, I wanted to make something that got people really stoked on being in the kitchen, cooking their own food, cooking for their families, cooking for themselves. And, you know, if you have this really sweet thing that you love to hold in your hand and that facilitates cutting up, you know, whole foods, vegetables, and meats and all the things that, you know, you enjoy eating.
Yeah.
And, you know, I thought, man, I could take this whole like life of art and culinary experience and my own interest in health and well-being and wrap it into creating this object, you know, that people get to use.
Dude, I could totally see you doing posts about that.
Yeah.
On Instagram.
Yeah, I know. I talk about it. I haven't really. A lot of people maybe just don't know that, and it's funny because enough time's gone by, and it's interesting because I think of like my mentor Ty, like he's a total recluse, you know, and yet he was like one of the pioneering guys in the like pre-ABS early American Bladesmith Society. I mean, there was like Ty and Don Fogg and like Jay Henderson. I mean, there was just like these.
Right.
You know, those are the dudes that were like starting this thing out, along with like Bill Moran and. And, you know, I think I'm a little like that too. I kind of just hide out because being a solo studio artist, you just end up spending a lot of time just on your own. And, but yeah, I'm ready to change that. I'd like to get out a little bit more. So at least thanks for having me on here. I'm still
hell yeah,
but more people get some exposure.
Yeah. Well, I feel like everything you're saying like rings so true to me too, because like just talking about why you got into knives and how that and helps people with being more involved and engaged with their own nutrition and well-being. And that is 100% my biggest why I do make my knives. There's of course I'm going to forget his name right now, but anyways, there's this Simon Sinek. He's I don't know what you would call him, but he's kind of like a motivational speaker guy, and he came out with a book called Know Your Why, or what's your why. But it's basically, it's like trying to understand why you do what you do. And it made me really think, like, what is it about knife making that drives me to want to do this work? Is it because I can make money from it? It's definitely not that. It's great because for me it's a way for me to be creative and to put that creativity out in the world. But I think the thing that really strikes home for me is the connection that you have, like once you make that thing, like you were saying earlier with your stone sculpture, like you make it and it's more kind of for your own personal expression, but then it goes either it stays with you or it goes out into the world, but then it just kind of, it's like it's there. And I think there's beauty in that art and fine art, especially because it's inspirational, people. And I think having creativity around us is really important to help motivate us and to inspire us to find whatever our own personal genius or creativity is, to then incorporate that into our lives and put it back out into the world. And so for me, making the knives and having that aspect of creating something that's kind of for my own fulfillment of creativity and the challenge of execution and creating and actually making the thing, but then putting that out into the world in a way that it is not only visually appealing and maybe inspirational to somebody, or inspiration on other makers to try something new or different, but it goes into somebody's hands and they can use that. And they find so much more pleasure and enjoyment in using that tool to make the food that they use to either, take care of themselves, take care of their loved ones. And it connects them more to that process of creating food and self-care and well-being. And it's so I feel like it's underrated but so vital and important. I mean, we have to eat, right? And whatever we can do to elevate that experience so it's not a chore, so it's actually a lot more fun. Whatever we can do to, like, turn on some music, get better pots and pans, use some like fun ingredients, or unusual ingredients, try some new recipes, do it with your friends, like all these things help make that so much more fun, because it absolutely is an important thing for us. And
it's true. And I mean, and that's where the knife really comes in. I mean, it was one of the number one things I would, it would be the top thing I would ask. And when I was going into people's homes, it was after I had a couple gnarly shoulder things and whatever. And so I was post-surgery and I wasn't really able to make knives. And so I was with a practitioner helping her clients that were coming out of like different phases of like kind of critical phases of healing. Or a lot of them were like post cancer, like post, they were just healing from big stuff and they needed to eat differently. And I would always, go into their homes, their kitchens, and I'd ask them, well, show me your favorite knife. Like, what do you like to cook with? And literally 50% of the time people hold like a little paring knife. And it was really important for me because it made me realize like there's no right knife. Like the right knife is the one that you dig. And it could be like a $6 knife from Target that you just dig and you use it all the time, or it could be one of your knives, or it could be some funky thing you found at the swap meet. I mean, I got a couple swap meet knives in my block that were like old American made. But so the knife is so amazing because so we get into this thing of like the meditation of being in the kitchen and like the joy and what makes it joyful. Because I think a lot of people just want to get to the table and sit down and eat, right? They just want that healthy meal to appear. And I think that a lot of the fun can be had along the way, and the knife and cutting, like learning how to use it, you don't have to be like crazy with it. And I think most of what's portrayed out there in terms of like knife skills is totally not right. In fact, when I was in culinary school, all these vertical choppy cuts and stuff that you see most people out there doing, like they would just be like, no. Like there was a kid that worked at the Hilton and he's in culinary school, and so he's already been cooking. And I remember this is in the cold kitchen class, the French, like
salads and
the
stuff,
garde, and so like, and it was an older lady. She was awesome. And, this is a tall kid, and here's this woman that's the chef, and she's just like, oh, honey, we don't do that around here. That's hotel. They're like tip anchored, rocking traditional French style cutting with a French knife. But anyhow, coming back to like being able to do traditional cuts, whether it's like small, medium dice, julienne, and just having fun, because actually all those shapes of the foods that you cut with your knife relate significantly to how the time and temperature in the pan are going to, let's say if you're doing a stir fry or if you're doing a sauteed thing, or even if you're building it into a soup, like, the constituents that you put in a soup have got to compose on a spoon. If it's like these big hunky, chunky, crazy pieces that won't compose on a spoon, well, it's going to taste differently. And you can cut your food 10 different ways and it's going to taste 10 different ways, and it all depends on how you stage it when you cook. And so it's just fascinating. There's so much fun. And that's the part where I try and inspire people that like, if you just slow way down, don't watch what you're seeing people doing in social media with their knives, because most of it's just crazy. And just learn how to cut. And if you need to get some tutoring on it, like look at some people that really know how to use knives like classically, and just start really slowly and dig, like doing your, what they would say, mise en place, which just means everything in place. Like dig creating all your cut up beautiful colors of veggies and your meats, and like just have that be like your art, and then get into making the food part. And it's nice for people to slow down and get into that. I mean, that's my most favorite part is time, when I can get it all cut up and it looks awesome, and now I'm ready to put it all together.
Yeah, and I do most of the cooking in the house, and oftentimes we're kind of in a rush, especially with a young one. It's like, all right, I just got home and we got 40 minutes maybe at the most for me to make dinner and get it on the table. But when I can take that time and kind of, I'm not trying to be like woo woo about it, but it's like more of a ritual around it. And I can take my time and I can be more careful and I can be more thoughtful about the size of the cut. Like you were saying, I actually read an article, I think it was about a year or two ago. And I don't know why it never dawned on me that the way you slice your food or cut and dice or whatever, the size of the dice, all of that plays into how it ultimately tastes because of the surface area that you're introducing to the overall dish. The larger the dice, the less surface area versus the smaller the dice, or the more surface area that's of the food that's for the same volume that's introduced to the overall dish. And I was like, holy shit, how have I never realized that? For me, it was always like a textural thing. Do I want it to be smooth? Do I want it to have a little bit of crunch or texture? Do I want it to have a lot? Like for me, that was the deciding factor on how I would cut things up or slice things up. And now I think I try to keep that in mind a little bit more about if I do a fine dice on this, it is going to definitely that flavor, whatever the thing is going to show up a lot more pronounced than I would have if I cut it a different way.
Exactly.
I will. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
I know, because I'm like a huge, like you're talking about time in the kitchen. I'm just like a huge fan of steamed vegetables because it's so easy, and there's so many things you can do, and the size you cut it can really relate to, like if you're in a hurry, like just like take something like a yam, and you're like, I love yams, but you're gonna bake a yam's gonna take you like an hour or 45 minutes or something if they're big. But you can take the same thing and you can cut it up, and then you could cut it like this big, or you could cut it this big if you have less time to steam it and stage it in your steamer, put other things on top of it you learn to cut things at a size and stage it in a way like into something super simple like a steamer.
Yeah.
And I mean, literally you can make an amazing meal like in 10 minutes, like, I mean, if you eat eggs and you know how to poach eggs really well, I mean, that was my like go-to things like steamed vegetables and poached eggs. Because let's face it, if you're going to be serious about your health and nutrition and you're going to cook yourself 3 meals a day, it's a serious time commitment. So I think that what people don't realize is like if they can just start slow and learn to use their knife in a way that they become confident, and maybe not necessarily have a lot of ingredients. Maybe you're only steaming 3 things or something or whatever. You can get to a place where you can prepare meals like frighteningly fast without having to feel like you have to become like a culinary expert to do it.
Right, with 100 different little portion dishes with a bunch of different
ingredients. Yeah, it gets crazy. I mean, I look at cookbooks sometimes. I look at these recipes and they've got like 32 ingredients. I'm like, this is crazy. Like, I'm like a big fan. I used to tell people like that Sundays at Moosewoods, which was like the ethnic night at the restaurant in New York.
Okay,
that book is solid. It's like it's international cuisine. The recipes are worked out to a T. Anyone could cook out of that book. I seriously would, like my clients I was teaching like cooking, I would just tell them all, just buy that book. And if you cooked out of that book for a year, even if you didn't know how to cook at all, by the end of the year, you will know how to cook.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
Can you say the name again?
Called Sundays at Moosewoods.
Sundays at Moosewoods.
Yeah, Moosewoods is a restaurant in New York, very famous. And Sundays was like their ethnic night. So I think it's got like 14 or 16 different authors. So there's like Thai food,
oh wow,
Indian food, there's Mexican food, there's Greek food. Some of the best soups I've ever made in my life are out of that book, and it's just a killer book. Like that, everyone should have that. Just because
that sounds great.
You feel like, man, I don't know what to make, or you're really befuddled, and you feel kind of like I don't know what's. And like it's a great thing, like you started out saying, like people don't know what spices and stuff maybe go together. That book will definitely school you on like what flavor profiles work, and then after that, you'll be off to the races. You can make up your own stuff and do whatever you want.
That's great. I love that we're talking so much about food, but I think, especially as both of us being culinary knife makers, it's really important to have that relationship to food. And like there are plenty of knife makers who make great knives who don't necessarily cook. But I do think if you want to get kind of an edge up on the competition, quote unquote, it is really gonna help you to understand how that knife is used and how that tool is used. I think I've probably referenced this before, but there's a really great book called An Edge in the Kitchen, and it literally is just like a classically trained French chef. I think he's an instructor. I can't remember where, but he goes through all the different kinds of cuts and how, like butchery of chicken and filleting fish and stuff like that. But he goes through like the julienne and chiffonade and fine dice and medium dice and all mincing and everything. And it's a great resource just to better understand how to use your knife in general. And I think a lot of people, I think I'd have to look at the book again, but I feel like the book teaches you some techniques, and then it has a recipe so that you're using those techniques right away to make something. If anything, though, and people can, if they're cutting up especially carrots, potatoes, like I think a lot of people do cutting practice or cutting tests, and then I'm guilty of this, and then it just gets thrown in the trash. But if you just like have a gallon Ziploc bag handy nearby, throw it all in there, throw it in the freezer until you're ready to use it, then make a soup from it. And like all you gotta do is like melt down the butter, put the stuff in there, let it kind of saute, add some whatever, and blend it up, and boom, you got a soup. So An Edge in the Kitchen is a really great resource. Oh, Mike said
Mike just said he scored that book. Yeah, you're gonna love it. I mean, I know it's summertime, but the soups are good. There's cold soups in there. It's just a fun book. It's a good one for anyone to have on their shelf. And I am not a huge fan of cookbooks because most of them are just not all that inspiring or helpful, honestly. But that one I feel super solid about. I mean, that book is it's just fun. It's easy. You look at the ingredients lists aren't out of hand. It's all stuff you can pretty much get, But yeah, and I think that it'll inspire kind of different knives to use along the way too.
Yeah.
I mean, it's really fun. I mean, getting into more some talk about knives. I mean, it's interesting, Mariko, you were like one of the first guys I think I saw really doing like integral Damascus, and now it's become like everyone makes at the show in Sacramento. I walked around the room. I was like, wait, like every single maker is making integral Damascus knives. I was like, you guys are all crazy. Like that is so much work.
Yeah,
it's beautiful, but I mean, it's funny because that was the very first knife I made with Thai was a full tang integral knife. That's all I really wanted to make. Like, 100%. Like that style of construction is so beautiful, so elegant, has so much potential, is so strong.
Well, it's so classic for especially like a French chef's knife, like a sabatier or like some of the German knives.
Yeah, I mean it's so beautiful, and it's also so wildly challenging to do. Now there's different ways that people are doing it, but yeah, I mean it's interesting. I mean, anyone that's doing it will, I think, all agree that it's a challenge. I think especially if you're not doing a ton of stock production, like if you're really working out of a piece of 3/4 inch round bar or 1 inch round, and that's all you got.
Right.
I mean, it's really different because I'm watching some of the processes that that are being done with the Damascus, and it's just like you have a lot more material, and so you can kind of play with it a little bit more.
For sure.
Yeah,
I remember. So I worked for Bob Kramer for 3 years, and all we did was stock removal and like full tang handle assemblies and sculpting and everything like that. And then I got into making my own knives and forging integrals. And at first I was like, oh my God, these are a fucking nightmare. But then I got to the point where I was really comfortable with them. And then when I tried to I can't remember when I did this, but I stepped back into doing a non-integral, I think some sort of full tang or just a hidden tang, like a non-integral hidden tang. I was like, I can't remember how I'm supposed to do this or what steps was I mean, it became a huge pain in the ass and it totally slowed down. And I think they both have their challenges more than anything. Ultimately, they both have their challenges. And once you get into a flow of doing one type or another, it becomes a lot easier for sure. But yeah, it's interesting, like kind of transitioning back and forth between the non-integrals and integrals.
Yeah, the integrals take practice. I know when I kind of hadn't done one for a while, and I'll feel like, oh, I want to make one. It always it's cool. It slows me down, and I loved them because they were more like sculpture. And also, I was just such a huge fan of that work that the Brazilian smiths were doing.
Right, with the gaucho
knives in the 80s. Like all those guys doing in the early years when Rodrigo was a young guy. And Ricardo Villar, and like those guys were just like, there was just a handful of them that were sort of more visible to us in the USA. And looking at their work, and I had bought some of those guys' work and used them a ton. Like, I wish I had not sold any of Rodrigo's knives because you can't even get one now. But
wow, you had some of his knives?
I had like 5 or 6 of his knives. I had one that was like a Mediterranean.
I just got like my whole body just got goosebumps. That's fucking crazy.
I had this Mediterranean like dirt kind of thing that looked like a chef knife. That's why the other reason I loved all that Brazilian work is because it just looked like a chef knife, but it was like a gaucho knife, and it was 5200. I used the living daylights out of that thing. I had it in a commercial kitchen for a year, using it. My family owned a restaurant when we were out there doing the school, so I was working in their kitchen a bunch. And I like sharpened it twice in a year, and I was using the crap out of that thing.
Sure.
It was just like, So and it's so funny. I finally just forged a little gaucho knife for the first time. So here I am, like, that was my original inspiration, other than my very first knife I made with Thai, which was kind of like a bit of a gaucho-y sort of thing.
Sure.
I finally made one like 16 years later. I'm like, I think I'll make a gaucho knife.
Yeah, and for people who might not be familiar with the gaucho knives, and either Don, you or Mike can jump in and correct me if I'm wrong. But basically, they look like what are typically referred to as integral chef's knife. They have usually like a stylized bolster, which actually some of the examples I have of your work has some of that stylized bolster action going on. And then they can either be full tang or hidden tang that go into the handle. But the main difference, while they look overall aesthetically look like a culinary knife, they do have a much heavier geometry because they're a hard use knife. They're a camp knife, basically.
Yeah, they are. Yeah, and that's something, you know, I go back and forth on all the time, you know, and I've had not a lot of criticism of my work, but there's been a couple people out there that I've sent work to, and they felt like, you know, it's too thick, or it's a, you know, I think it's just one of those things, like this type of knife you use, that's a preference. I mean, it's a really, you know, making it as a handmade thing, I think the geometry is probably really the most challenging part.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, there's a ton of people out there that are just doing flat grinds, and like, if you have a grinder and you can push against a belt, anyone can do a flat grind. But in my personal experience and my own philosophy is like, flat grinds don't work particularly great in the kitchen. In a home kitchen, I think it's fine, you know, when you're just cutting a couple things and you're not really doing a lot of food prep. But yeah, and then now there's all these different, everyone's got different ideas about geometry, and you know, the Japanese have their whole thing, these short little Scandi grinds, which with the 0-degree edge work phenomenally well. It's actually kind of interesting. But, you know, if you look at any of those Japanese knives, they kind of cold forge a bit of like what they would call like an S grind now into the side of it. So it's, I mean, this is the thing that makes it fun and also really challenging, is the dynamic aspect of like, what is that edge geometry going to be like on any specific knife, you know, because it's going to be different on a bigger knife than on like a much smaller knife or even a paring knife.
Right.
Yeah, so it's fun, you know, and not always like haha, yay fun, but like challenging fun, you know.
Yeah, and I think anybody who says this one grind is the grind or this thickness is the thickness, we kind of touched on it before, but for every person, there is a particular preference of weight, blade thickness, size of blade, geometry, and so if anybody experiences somebody or maker or even collectors who can also get very opinionated, which is fine, but I think that it's when people get too prescriptive and say this is the only way, it's that's where it becomes problematic, because what works for one person does not always work for another.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, everyone's got a different style, and I think that I mean, that's kind of where, you know, and with Abe, you know, we talked a lot about, you know, the whole conversation leading up to his brand called Living Steel, which, you know, it was interesting how that came about. I won't go into the whole story, but, you know, we were talking about rebranding me, and I was like, I don't know, like, I don't make that many knives. Like, I don't know, you can rebrand me, but if I had like 1,000 people that wanted a knife like today, I would just be like, I don't know when you're going to get that knife. Like, it's just me.
Yeah.
You know? It's like, you know, and people got to remember, like, I've been making knives for, you know, it'll be 17 years next year, but I came into it with 20 years making stuff. So, you know, the human body, I mean, I was even talking to Ty about it. He was like, you know, we're talking about how our hands are feeling wearing out and stuff. And he's like, dude, he's like, think of all the power tools we've gone through, but our hands are still working. I was like, wow, that's something to think about. Like, you know, like the machinery,
I've never taken that into
machinery is dying, but we're still going, you know?
Right.
But at any rate, back to like kind of, so the thing with Living Steel, and we talked a lot, where like, you know, the whole philosophy is like, there is no right knife. Like, you know, and there's really no, you know, people get super opinionated, and man, I would like avoid conversations about metallurgy like the plague at Hammer Ends, because like, I just don't want to have that conversation with anybody, because, you know, I really, especially with Ty being my teacher, I think I make work in a way more of an alchemical way. I mean, I do it more in a traditional, you know, intuitive, not that I haven't read about metallurgy and know what I need to know, and yet I still am doing things very much in I would say a more mystic alchemical way than like a scientific way, you know. And then there's friends of mine like Matt Gregory, who's an amazing knife maker and just a solid human being, and like his work is phenomenal, and we talk all the time, and we're like polar opposites, man. He's like a scientist with it, and he's like super, and I learn a lot from him every time. And but in terms of like the geometry and all that kind of stuff, it's fascinating. And profiles, like you and I talked a little bit about, you were saying like, oh, it'd be fun to see makers sort of spread their wings and try new profiles. And it really, with a chef knife of any type, it's very challenging to do. I think if I had one way to inspire people to kind of explore different profiles, and this was a funny thing because I asked a lot of the newer makers at the Sacramento show that I had not met before, like, hey, do you guys study vintage knives? And like pretty much hardly anybody. I don't think anyone said they did. But I think studying vintage knives is a great way to like get some inspiration around profiles because you can kind of see what came before. Because honestly, there's not a lot you can do with profiles. Like I've been putting that little sort of step in the top of my blade because I was like, well, I want it to look different, but I can't really mess with like the edge geometry or the edge like profile too much. I mean, if it's a butcher knife or a boning knife, you can put more belly.
Right.
So it's wildly dynamic and also like has to work too, and the weight and all of it. I mean, people would ask me all this stuff about like, how do your knives balance so well? How do you get them to balance like that? And I have no idea. I mean, I think that
I get the same question. I'm like,
I mean, it's not like I have a scale and I'm weighing. It's not like I'm like weighing a piece of ironwood and I'm weighing the blade and I'm like telling some math calculation. I mean, to me, it seemed like if like it's visually, aesthetically, it balances, then they just always balance, and it's even small knives, and then everyone has a different opinion about that. I have my own ideas about how and where they should balance depending on the knife.
Yeah.
But yeah, I want to bounce this one off you because there is a trend I'm seeing, and I did it myself. I was kind of got into doing a lot for my version of a Kutsuke. And I kind of stuck on that because I like those three angles. I like that sort of clip tip and then that long, kind of ramp up to a flat portion. And that's sort of like the Kutsuke, which in Japanese realm was really just kind of an all around knife.
Right.
I was doing them all different sizes. So my edge the belly really kind of went away in those because it wasn't totally gone. It was definitely there. But I was making a lot of those. And after a while, I thought, man, I'm really missing having more belly in my knives. And I'm seeing more and more makers doing knives that are almost like a straight razor, like very flat at the edge. And the only thing that I've come up with, and you let me know if you've thought about this at all, but because I was trying to think like, why is this trend going in this direction of very, very, very little belly? Okay, very little belly on a knife is going to like do in the kitchen. It's like really fun. However, if you're watching a lot of the modern sort of like portrayal of people cutting these speed vertical cuts, I think that's kind of where it came from. I think that there's so many kind of like videos of people cutting and with not horrible technique, albeit. I mean, at least they got their hands so that they're keeping their fingers from being chopped off and they can do precision cuts. But a lot of this fast vertical cutting and I think that that's kind of where because that's where that knife's going to work well. It's not going to work super well if there's no belly to do really anything other than that or pulling it through the food.
Yeah.
But yeah, I want to bounce it off you because I haven't really had to ask anyone that lately. And I probably offended a bunch of other knife makers out there that are
No.
But I did it too. I didn't go totally flat, but I definitely, with those Kutsukes, I started regrinding a bunch of the templates that I had heat treated already because I thought, man, there's just not enough belly in this thing to work right.
Yeah, when I first started making knives, I thought that there was a flat area, maybe like if you split the length, say it's a 9-inch chef's knife, you split it into thirds.
Yeah.
Maybe almost the first half, like first 4 inches would be flat. That's what I thought.
Yeah, at the heel.
From the heel to, and so then I started. I'm fortunate to have Blade Gallery up here, and have them as a resource to be able to see, especially when I was first starting out. To really like spend a lot of time looking at a lot of Japanese knives as well as European production knives, but on the I really love the profile of the more Japanese style knives. But when you sight down them, say you take, I wish I had my knife handy, but you, instead of like spine and edge, if you lay it down flat and you're looking down the cutting edge, you can see that it actually almost never is completely flat. There's at least just like the gentlest little curve there.
Yeah.
And maybe it only differentiates off flat by maybe only a couple millimeters or even a millimeter.
Yeah.
Very, very subtle. But then the front third of my blades always have a little bit of curve, just in case somebody does want to do a rock chop, and so that the tip has clearance for being able to get at least a couple inches off the board for like a bell pepper or potato or something like that.
Yeah.
Right. But I am actually one of the, and I don't know where this came from. I think I just, I don't think I, at least as best as I can recall, I don't remember seeing it anywhere. But I come from a background in working in restaurants and kitchens in a kind of a production environment, like you were talking about, especially in regard to the flat grind. Like it might be fine in the home kitchen, but in a production environment, flat grind fucking sucks.
Yeah.
I'm sorry if anybody's doing the flat grind and they love it, but it is not the best for a production environment because the food is so readily engaged with the surface of or the knife that it just it creates a lot of cut friction, the food sticking, and then when it pops off, it goes flying across the room. That's where a gentle convex or compound grind or something really helps to reduce that surface engagement and help that food more readily fall off. Not necessarily fall off every time. But anyways,
yeah, and it's interesting. I mean, and that's not just like your opinion or my opinion. I mean, I came to the whole commitment to a convex geometry for the most part, really from, 18, 20 years of like studying and buying and collecting and giving away and reselling like vintage knives. I almost never have seen a vintage knife that's been made in the last 200 years that's flat.
Even the Sabatier.
And I thought, okay, so this is interesting that like 98% of any knife I've seen from the earliest knives I had from like the maybe 1820s up until like the 1980s, like none of them were flat except for maybe 2%, like maybe some smaller knives or,
when it comes to like a paring knife or tournet or even a slicing knife,
like
that convex geometry isn't necessarily as important.
So, and it's preference and like, I want to apologize to the people that are doing flat grinds too, especially if you decide
fuck all you guys doing flat grinds.
Especially if you decide that you're going to abandon it and start doing convex grinds, because then you're going to call us up and be like, this is really a pain in the ass because it is not easy, and I don't do it on a grinder. Like I'm like such a weirdo. I think it's even on my YouTube channel, like that nobody looks at. I don't think because I don't continue to post, but like I'm using like a handheld like variable speed like angle grinder basically. I demoed a Travis Wirtz hammer in, and people were like, what are you doing? And I'm like, I'm just doing it the way I do it. You know what I mean?
Sure.
And it's just like I have a ton of control, and that's how I finalize all my geometry on my knives with like a completely non-flexible backup pad, which is essentially made for surfacing marble countertops, and like a hook and loop disc and water. And if it's sitting, I really have to be ultra careful with. I'll run the cool mist on it or whatever. But so yeah, I mean, we all come up with our own way, and again, there's no right or wrong. I mean, the main thing is to enjoy it. Because it can become unenjoyable pretty quickly. Somebody just said something to me the other day who's an amazing craftsperson, and he's now making knives. I was teaching some high school kids up where he's a facilities manager up in Cambria. And he was like, the longer you do something, the harder it gets. And I thought about that for a while. I thought,
that speaks so true.
I think that actually is true because like I can say that in 16 years of making knives, I think I've gotten better at it, but I don't think it's gotten easier. Like it definitely hasn't gotten easier, And I remember in the early years of getting into this and going to shows, I'd see these Mastersmith knives, and the blades wouldn't be perfectly straight, or there'd be things that were a little funky. I was like, well, yeah, the guy that made this is like 75 years old. His vision's shot. His hands are probably fried. It's like now I know like why those knives are like that, because I'm seriously making less and less knives lately just because like they have to be excellent. Like I can't be like 16 years into this thing and make something wonky or funky that I don't feel is like of a very high caliber. And so to continue doing work like that is really necessitating me to slow down. And time these days is like of a whole new order. Like I can't even get into that conversation because it just goes by really fast. And people are like, it's because you're getting older. I was like, I don't think that's the only reason.
Yeah. And I do want to actually jump back well, take a break and jump back. Mike Poor, so earlier we were talking about knife skills and cutting.
Mm-hmm.
Mike Poor jumped in and said that Murray Carter actually has a series of DVDs that are now on YouTube on sharpening, but a whole set on how to use and sharpen specific knives. And I think that's another thing to take into consideration too, is like different knives are designed for different tasks. And that's also another really important reason to understand and have a stronger relationship with how the tools are being used, because you don't use a paring knife the exact same way you would use a chef's knife or a slicing knife or a cleaver. You know, it's all over the place. You were talking about the gaucho knives, and Mike make a comment about the frickin' Brazilians. But he also did say that they're typically shaped more like a Tsujihiki or a classic carving knife.
Yeah.
And they have the bomba style bolster, often have and also have a butt cap.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and so I think there may be typically around 1.5 inches, maybe pushing a 1.75 inches. Where I think, at least for me personally, when I'm making my chef's knives, anywhere from like a Santoku that's 6.5 inches long to a large chef 10-inch chef's knife, I'm usually shooting for at least 2 inches to 2.25 inches height, depending on the size of the knife.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, even when I'm forging, I'll buy 1.5 inch material to forge out of, you know, and I'm generally it's like maybe 3/16, so maybe close to 1/4 inch or something like that. But, you know, I like the elbow room to be able to compose on the anvil and kind of go that route. I have started doing more stock reduction in the past few years because, you know, there's just a lot of people that want a stainless knife. And I think that's totally fine. I don't have a huge, you know, I used to be pretty staunch about like carbon steel, it's the thing. And now I'm kind of like, you know, I found a stainless that I really like. I think I really appreciate the Swedish stainless. And, you know, I found the one that I dig. And it was a process of having good friends in the world, like Jens Anzo, you know, and owning many of his knives and using the daylights out of them. I have a camp knife by Jesper. Vox knives, and you know, I just beat the hell out of that thing in RW 34, and I love that steel. And everyone's like, it's the same as ATS 34. I'm like, chemically sure, but I don't know. The Swedish folks, Dama Steel, they're doing something with it that's different. I don't care what anyone says. Maybe I'm just a weirdo, but it's my experience. It just sharpens easy and holds really great edge, and it gets that wicked type popping edge. And so I've been.
Well, I don't know if the ATS 34 is powdered metallurgical steel, is it, or is it?
I don't know. I mean, I'm just the thing
because I know the Sandvik stuff is.
That's why I don't have a lot of conversations about metallurgy with anyone because they all sound like a super dope, you know. But like, it's hard to find what you like. I mean, there's a lot of stainless steels. You know, I don't know that I really believe that high Rockwell and high wear resistance is necessarily what you want in a kitchen. I mean, you got to really, and it's not like I want to stay in the Stone Ages or anything. But at the same time, you know, in a commercial kitchen, like, you know, something that's like super high wear resistant or super duper fragile. Like, I love Japanese knives. And I think that in terms of task specific, I think the Japanese realm is like the coolest place to look for task specific knives because all of their knives are like,
absolutely,
really, you know. But, you know, that real high kind of carbon content and that style of very thin edges. I mean, they're beautiful. I use them often in my own kitchen, but they're so fragile. You just have to be careful. So it's a time and place. It's a preference. But, you know, I think that stainless steel is important in a kitchen, oftentimes in commercial kitchens, because you just don't have the time to maintain a carbon blade. And then, you know, I'm going to start playing with some kind of more medium carbon steel knives because I'm having a hard time finding really excellent, like 1095 was like my go-to in the last 6-7 years. I just cannot find a 1095. It just seems like it's just not available. I don't think it's being produced in standards that are even remotely close to some of the more high quality stainless steels. So it's the times and I think people don't really talk about that kind of thing. And I don't mean to like stir the pot of dissension or anything, but I mean, I've been doing it not forever, but long enough so that things have changed. And I've talked about it with a few other people, and the general consensus is that getting super quality carbon steel is tough. You know, now I think the Japanese have an easier time, but then you have to want to work with those real high carbon steels. And I think that, you know, the backbone of the culinary world chef knives that have been made. I mean, this is why these knives that are in my block from like the 1830s are still alive, because they're basically like probably a medium carbon steel at a Rockwell like 54, 56. They're like a spring. You can't hurt it. It will never break. It might rust if you don't take care of it, but like you can't hurt a knife like that. Like, you know, and so I wonder, you know, I mean, it's all preference, and I think it's something that is worth talking about only just for a matter of perspective. Because I mean, I think if somebody wants to own a really high, you know, I mean, Ty said it best. He's like, a high performance knife is like a high performance motor in a car. He's like, you know, it's probably not going to stand the test of time. And so, you know, at least my personal vibe around making knives is I wanted to make heirloom quality pieces that would be around for a long time, that were tough. And, you know, if you did abuse it a little bit, it would hang in there. It's tough. It's a hard balance to strike as a maker, really, and it's a tough thing to really portray or kind of, I don't know, get people excited or even educated about, depending on what they've read. You know, I mean, I think people really look a lot at sort of trends, and the trend is more towards high Rockwell and that kind of thing, which I think certainly is more applicable to like modern stainless steels. Like they can handle it. I mean, they're engineered that way, you know, whereas, you know, simple carbon steels, considering the state that we're getting them in, which is variable in my experience, trying to push those to a high Rockwell, it may not be the best idea, really. So it's, I mean, and this is more sort of the scientific side of it. And I don't really talk about it like a scientist at all. I just do more like an empirical sort of approach with it, and just trying to find what works, you know, because I don't want people to have to suffer and feel like, oh man, it's either not holding an edge long enough, which no knife is ever going to not need sharpening, or now like it's just so wickedly difficult to sharpen or hone. It's an interesting world. The functionality part of it is, you know, a real thing. And I remember being at shows and people would come up and they'd be like, oh, my knives are dull. And I'm like, well, what do you do to maintain them? And they just look at me and be like,
no,
I don't do anything. So like, well, you know, it's like drive your car around, never put gas in it, you know. It's not,
or never change the oil. You can blow the motor up. Yeah, I agree. I think, I mean, something that you don't hear people talk about very often is that to achieve a 60 Rockwell in a basic carbon steel, you only need a 0.5% by weight.
Yeah.
You don't need a ton. And so you see like carbon steels at like 50-100s at like 1% or 1, and all these others are really high carbon steel. And the question is like, what benefit especially once you've achieved your desired hardness at 60 with that whatever 0.5%, what's the rest of it doing in that steel? Is it actually benefiting the performance of that knife, or is it potentially hindering it? But obviously a lot of that, what plays into that is how the material was handled before, and the carbides, like what do the carbides look like that have built up, or what has been done to kind of control them and cycle them back down or shrink them or reduce them. And playing with grain structure and all that kind of stuff, it really plays into that. I do think that is really important. Like, while it might be cool to talk about and there are some cool boutique stainlesses, but you got to think of it from a maker perspective on how much time is it going to take for you to use a high wear resistant steel to make a knife, and then how does that translate into the sale of the piece? But then, because it's a high wear resistant steel, how is that going to translate into the end user and what they're going to be able to do to continue to maintain it over the life of the knife? You're not going to be standing there as the maker holding their hand forever. They ideally would be able to sharpen it themselves, or be able to very easily or readily hand it off to a professional sharpener who then could professionally sharpen it themselves. But again, a lot of the sharpeners are working with stuff that is not the same steel, and so potentially they're abusing that steel. And I'm not saying that people need to start just using crap steel, but I think you got to think about those things instead of it just being, because if somebody's overly obsessed with the very specific type of steel, like are you using the best, most boutique steel that's available right now in the market? Because they, for whatever reason, they want to be like, that's a flex point for them. Basically, that's a marketing point. That's part of being able to turn around and brag to somebody, oh, my knife is made from such and such steel. And I was like, that's great and all, but how does it perform? How easy is it to sharpen and maintain? What does it take to keep it clean and all that kind of stuff? Those are all things that people, I think, knife makers need to think about a little bit more instead of just getting caught up in what is cool. I think they should still balance that with what is actually practical and functional, especially us as culinary knife makers, or people making hunting knives or camp knives that are actually being used, to really think about how that is ultimately going to work out over the long term versus pieces. There are tons of beautiful knives, folding knives and Bowie knives that end up on shelves or only are carried in a beautiful leather sheath and brought out and showed at a show, or only used to, like, if it's a fancy folder, maybe only to like cut cigars or open a box every once in a while. Like, they're not actually getting like hard use, right? Versus a culinary knife and a hard, like a Hunter, Bowie, Skinner, all those kind of, or not Bowie, but like camp knives and stuff like that. Like,
I mean, a chef knife is really like, it's kind of, and I do it because of all the reasons we already talked about, is just the interest in cooking and health and well-being. But like, I mean, it's really the only knife I can think of that would have its edge battered against the surface, like in a commercial kitchen, like hundreds, thousands of times a day. Sure. I mean, no other like pocket knife, nobody would ever cut that much stuff. And it's funny, Mike made a comment about, performance knives and then people cutting on like bamboo or corian. I'm like, oh yeah. I mean, what people choose to cut on is a whole other, subject, because bamboo is so popular, but it's also like, I think Matt Gregory said, he's like, I don't know why people would cut on the most abrasive grass grown on the planet. It's like such a tough material. It's really, really hard on knife edge.
Right. Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, it is more complex. And I think the thing around steel choice has a lot to do, again, with personal preference and style. Like, I mean, some people maybe want to work that hard and use 3V and like sand that thing for 5 days or whatever. But, I think people maybe have to really kind of get pragmatic in their heads around the fact that like we are doing these things. At least I do so much by hand. Like, I mean, I didn't even have a grinder or any power tools for 7.5 years. And then I had a student stumble into my studio and bought a drill press for me from a garage sale on his way to take a class from me, learning how to make knives. And, and eventually I bought a grinder and stuff. Yeah. But like, I really started this out super tool simple and purposefully so, because I just didn't want to have a lot of machinery. Mm-hmm. So, I think that for people to keep in mind that this is like a completely handmade thing, like handheld. I don't have a lot of jigs and fixtures. I mean, I look at Charlie Ellis and like I feel like he's like the MacGyver of knife making.
He totally is.
He's coming up.
He's like, "Late, I'll be right back. I'm gonna go make."
It's so rad. Like, I wish I got to hang out with him more, because like I just love that his brain works that way. Mine totally doesn't work that way. Like, I am not inventing tools. Like, even like forge tongs. People are like, "Oh, did you make your own tongs?" I'm like, dude, I can buy a pair of tongs for like $18. It's gonna last me like the rest of my life. It will take me like a month or two to figure out how to even make a really good pair. And like, I just don't have the time. So you see, new knife steels, like Magna Cut or whatever, and like Chris Reeve knives, like great. Like, I would love to have a Chris Reeve knife in Magna Cut, but they got to realize like that's like a factory thing. Like, there's nobody's hands are holding on to anything when that stuff's being made. I mean, I just watched the thing and it was interesting. I mean, I like traditional knives, so it's like, I think Great Eastern Cutlery, they do a lot of like traditional pocket knives started in 2006. It's interesting. They're in Tutsville, Pennsylvania, and I saw they have a little video on their production, and it's just like all big, giant die-cut machinery popping out the blades, and like, there was maybe eventually, I'm sure there's some processes where people are holding things by hand, but there's a big difference between manufacture or even light manufacture and like, a dude like me that's like basically in his garage, which is underneath the room I'm sitting in right now, making things 100% by hand,
Right.
It's a really different thing, and it's more of a humble experience, and I mean, challenging in its own ways. But I hope that people kind of can think that like, you're really getting something that's like completely like has all this love and attention put into it, because that's just the way I choose to do it. Because I want to have somebody owns something that's really unique and really special and highly functional, that also just has some mojo, you know?
Yeah. Well, again, it goes back, I think, to kind of what you were saying before, in regards to like the stone carving, like how that is an expression of your creativity. It's something that comes from within you and it's out into the world, but then it doesn't really have the kind of relationship that you would like it to have with somebody. And that's where the knives play, and where they can, that part of you that you've manifested into the world through your own hard work, through your hands and through your eyes, and you know, your attention to detail and care, then goes into somebody's house, and that part of you becomes part of their life.
Yeah.
And I think there's a lot of power in that. I think it's really cool, and it's a great way for us to maintain or strengthen or create connections with each other.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. I see Mike was asking about the sayas that I'm making, which
Yeah.
definitely gone through an evolution. Okay, so yeah, that's a funny story how these started out. So my sister is a quilter.
Okay, and I have a ton of pictures of some of these sites.
Yeah, so she, you know, at one point had a bunch of fabric she wasn't using and gave them to me because she knew I liked fabric. I mean, I honestly really wanted to go to fashion design school out of high school because I just think clothing is really fascinating. And so, like, she had all this fabric, and those are actually the early ones. Those are all fabrics that she gave me. So this is like leftovers from my sister's quilting, and this is back when the interior of these things it was like cardboard.
Okay.
Right? And so, and the way it started was I had a knife. In fact, I think you have a picture of the one that goes in that one with the little black cross on it.
Oh yeah,
it was like it was a happy camp fish knife. I was carving this little face into this.
Oh, I see the face
knife.
now.
It was like a little fish face that I carved into it. So that was the very first one I ever made, the saya. And it was just like a piece of cardboard I folded in half and stuck a piece of duct tape on each side. And I wrapped that fabric around it and put that little tie around it.
Sure.
And the tie was a way to, like, if it got a little loose in there, you could tie that braided
cord
a little tighter and snug it up, right? And that was just so that I could take it. And I was like, you know, surfing a lot for many years, and I was going to the beach, and this dude that I knew was like, I want to buy a knife from you. So I did that so I could take it to the beach with me and have it be safe as I took it, right? So the whole idea about these was like to be able to take a knife with you and have it in something that keeps the knife safe, keeps you safe from the knife. And that's really how it started. And so it evolved from there to, in fact, I think I remade it. So the one in this picture now is actually that same fabric, but I decided, oh, well, what if I, you know, like spray mounted some Tyvek on the inside of this thing and then spray mounted the cloth over it. And so the early ones were made like that. And it was interesting because I was just swiping like the mailing envelopes from the U.S. Post Office and using that Tyvek.
Yeah, for sure.
Then I thought, I'm going to get locked up in federal prison if I keep stealing stuff from the post office.
No, they're giving it away for
I know, right? They're giving it away. But it's like right on there, it's like, this is only for mailing stuff. And I was like, oh, damn. So I buy like the rolls of Tyvek now. And then more recently, in the last maybe few years, I just decided to get like some really good quality, like laminated ash. So it's like
nice,
like door skin. And I still... you know, laminate the Tyvek to it, and then I use like Gorilla Tape. I mean, they're pretty ragamuffin, really, to get out. It was funny because Quentin Middleton rallied me one time, who's another good friend of ours, amazing, you know, talent and just an amazing human being, very successful too. I'm very happy for him how things are going. But he texted me one day. He's like, "Hey, how do you make those things?" I was like, "I can tell you, but if you start making them, you're going to be like, you're crazy making these things because you know, between the $10 roll duct tape." Like home decor fabric that's like 20 or 30 bucks a yard, the Tyvek, and then the spray mount. And then eventually Ty was like, oh, you should shellac those, like, you know, and toughen them up. So, you know, I buy pure flake shellac and I dilute it down with denatured alcohol, which now in California, you can't even buy denatured alcohol. So
really?
It's crazy. So I still am making them. I'm like if I have to make one or two, it's great. But if I have to make like, you know, 8 or 10 of them, I'm always like moaning that I'm never going to make these again. But I mean, I think that it's important to have. I did it specifically because it's such a huge difference between something that you can see the knife, that you can see what's in it, versus like putting something in a zippered pouch, which is fine.
Right.
But then, you know what's in the pouch. And then I get like in this picture, I get to pair it with the, you know, I can pick a fabric that goes with the handle And this was just this beautiful Japanese fabric that I still have a little bit left of, that I would do in my rainbow quench knives because it kind of has rainbows on it, right? And so it became kind of like a way to complete a package. And I feel like people really deserve that. By the time they're buying an $800, $1,200 knife, I feel like, you really ought to have something like really cool and really special,
100%.
And I mean, if I felt like I wanted to like take the time to carve like actual like wooden sayas, I mean, those things, I guess if you could get fast at it, that's fine. But those things are not, they don't look easy to make. I've made a couple and it's just like, wow.
Yeah.
Like,
I've whipped out a 3-piece. So basically like you would do with like leather. So you have right side, left side, and then a welt around the middle. I've done that with wood, and I've whipped out a saya in a day. But at the price point, again, that people are buying them at, like, I don't want that thing rattling around in there, and it has a tendency to do that. And so then I started being like, all right, well, let's put some leather linings on the. I'm building a couple sayas right now.
Yeah.
And so that's exactly what I'm doing. I'm putting leather lining on the inside. Everything's all pinned up together, so it all indexes. Just in general, just for the overall assembly and transferring lines and stuff like that, but to strengthen the thing. And it goes from being a 1-day build to being like 3 or 4 days. It's like, holy shit, I spend as much time making the fucking saya as I do building the damn knife sometimes.
Yeah, it's crazy. Yeah, thanks, Mike. I appreciate your positive words about it, because I do like them. I mean, I don't think I'll absolutely completely quit making them. I was able to find a source of like a type of adhesive. You can use Everclear or whatever, but through Amazon I can get the stuff, and it's just this the materials like everything. And not to sound like the oldest saw in the book, but like it's crazy how expensive everything is getting these days. Just the price of materials. I mean, I don't know if you've seen lately, like the price of certain ceramic belts have like literally just doubled.
Right.
And it's kind of like, wow, it just inspires me to get back to forging more closely to shape, which is kind of what I'm going to kind of play with some, medium carbon steels, some spring steels, some 5160. I think I'm going to play around with and just do some more precision forging, because that's really what I've done all along anyhow, is really, forging very close to shape. It's just, and really nobody taught me how to forge a chef knife. I really taught myself. I mean, that's the cool thing about starting out forging integrals, because if you're going to forge a knife out of a piece of round bar, you learn a lot about metal manipulation, and that really did help inform my ability to forge a chef knife. And I do it like you were saying, like in that picture, like you're cross peening the heck out of that thing. It's like, well, yeah, I don't know how else am I going to draw the bevels out?
No, exactly. That's
it was just sort of my own rational mind, which I don't
you
always
just
trust.
Beat the hell out of the thing.
Yeah, I don't always trust my rational mind so well. And yeah, that's a clip, and there's a video of that on my website where you see sort of what I'm doing there. And I mean, it works for me. I'm not saying it's the right way, but versus just trying to hit it with a flat part of the hammer to get it to move, and so I mean, I think the forging process is really fascinating, and despite what the metallurgy people say, I think that forged knives have some merit. I think there's a certain aspect of grain flow that's important.
Absolutely.
And it's just kind of fun, I mean, I don't know that I want to make every knife as a forged knife, just because physically it gets demanding. But yeah, I mean, I enjoy making the sayas. It's fun. It's playful.
They're beautiful.
But yeah, you get to see what's in it. And then when I started going to shows, that was also the main thing, was like, how does somebody get a knife home from a knife show, a super sharp chef knife? Because pouches are cool, but even if people are putting them in luggage and luggage gets thrown around, I mean, I haven't seen it happen, but I imagine like a really sharp knife could just poke right through.
Oh yeah, sure.
A zipper pouch, or even the end, you could put a cork on the tip. There's always something you got to do to try and keep it safe. And and I tell people when they get the sayas, at mine at least, are really just for transportation. They're not really meant for storage, because ideally I would love to see people with their knives just like in a block in their kitchen, or if you love magnetic strips, that's fine. I'm not a huge fan of them, just because I feel like anything that's vertical and the sharp thing, it's like, I don't know. I like a block, lay sideways, but everyone's got a preference. hopefully not just in a drawer with 10 other knives.
Yeah,
Right.
and I always say the same thing too, that the sayas or sheaths, whether it's a chef's knife or a hunting knife or a camp knife, whatever, it's not necessarily meant for long-term storage. It's meant for transportation and when you're actually using it. But when you're not going to be transporting it or it's going to be resting somewhere for a while, you don't want to necessarily leave it in the sheath because, especially carbon steel, like bad things can happen. If you happen to have some sort of moisture, residual debris, or something left on the blade, and then you put it in there, that could cause undesired corrosion and rusting or pitting or weird shit to happen. And so but yeah, I was looking at your size as I was going through Eating Tool, Abe's page over at Eating Tools. I'm like, fuck, these sires are so nice. I'm like, I wonder if I can like get him to make me some of these sires. But no, I think I just need to figure it out because they're absolutely beautiful, and I 100% agree with you that honestly, even at a few $100s, somebody should be getting something with that knife, especially at a show, though, that they can walk away with it because walking around with a knife is kind of fucking crazy looking.
Yeah, I mean,
and then honestly, it is genuinely dangerous.
It's a safety thing, 100%. And now, I mean, I generally will put a knife will come if I decide to make it. I don't make it for all my knives now, but most of them still, and it'll still be in the side, and then also come in a zipper pouch because then if I mail it, it's safe.
Right.
They have an option, and then if they don't want to store it in a block, they've got the zipper pouch to store the knife in. They don't have to keep putting it in the thing. But with the wood, they definitely hold up better because the cardboard would break down and it'd get loose and be funky. And I mean, I have locals that bring knives back that have been, kind of just you can tell they're storing it in it, and then they get all funky and gungy because they're not cleaning their knives or whatever. But yeah, I'd love to talk a little bit about knife design with you because I think that's something that people, we all sort of wonder where that inspiration comes from.
For sure. And I have a ton of photos. I just want to jump back to this comment that Mike makes. So we were talking about like boutique knives and really high carbon steel knives and all that kind of stuff. And he says he's got a rule. It says, Mike rule, if using Crew Forge V or Magna Cut, use only as sandmai because fucking hand sanding it, I ain't got time for that. And it's especially like I just hand sanded a Crew Forge V last month. And it had been a while since I'd done a whole, basically the whole blade. And I don't know if you've ever worked with Crew Forge V, but it is so wear resistant. It is so tough. It's right there with like W2, if not possibly worse than W2.
Yeah.
And it's not fun. So I think that is a good move with the higher hardness. I have actually, especially with I've made a couple knives that are like hunters or camp knives where I did kind of the finish grinding before heat treating. So I still had some, but because they're heavier, harder use knives, they have a thicker geometry at the edge. So it was still maybe like 40 thousandths at the edge. But before I heat treated that thing, I hand sanded it in the soft form up to 400 grit just to lessen the amount of hand sanding work I was going to have to do after it came out of heat.
That's a good way to go. Yeah.
It's such a bitch.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's the only reason that steel didn't really catch on more. I mean, I got a big stack of it, not huge, but I have some of it because they were just selling it for scrap prices. I mean, it got that. I think they did maybe one run of it or two runs of it. And, I still would like to make some knives out of it. It's pretty stiff under the hammer, but
it's very stiff.
It's it's good stuff. I think that it's worth putting out there into the world and letting people enjoy it, even if you can just possibly leave a machine finish. I just figured I'd leave like a 600 grit machine finish from my handheld and let people put their own scratches in it from the sponge. I mean, a lot of people don't realize the only reason anyone really ever needs to sand out a knife is the carbon steel is just to try and close those pores off. Like stainless, I think the only reason I sand my stainless blades and don't just leave a 600 grit machine finish, which just looks like little scallops the way I'm using a round wheel, is just because I don't want people to buy this thing that they just spend a bunch of money on, and then the first time they're cleaning it with a sponge, you're going to be going, parallel to the blade, and then they're going to put scratches in it from the sponge, then they're going to feel like they scratched their knife, and there's this whole kind of end user psychology that I think I do my best to consider because, like, not everyone's super cool with change, and that's where like the carbon steel is really hard for people. Like I got a client right now, really good guy, and I can tell he's just like had me make him so many knives, and he's just feeling like I want stainless knives. Like I don't feel like I can care for these carbon steel knives. And he showed me a picture. I'm like, no, they're totally fine. They're just patinaing. That's just like what's going to happen. But so it's, yeah, I mean, the end user side of it is, I guess, in some regards, kind of unpredictable. It depends on how people kind of can sort of deal with their own psychology around what something might look like or whatever.
Yeah, and I think kind of to step back to that part of the conversation where we're talking about stainless versus carbon, I think carbon steel is always going to have a place, just like cast iron.
Always, yeah.
Cast iron is always going to have a place in the kitchen. So is carbon steel.
Yeah.
I think maybe not necessarily in the kitchen. Well, I think also in the kitchen, but also out just in knife making in general. Carbon steel is always going to have a place, especially for knives that again are not getting hard used. But I think for me personally, especially because I do so much work in Damascus, I do think I feel really bad and I struggle with making these beautiful knives, making these cool patterns and stuff, and then people start using them, and then it starts to build up a patina, and sometimes the contrast of the pattern gets washed out.
Yeah.
And it's a bummer for me, but especially for the customer, like you were saying about change, like to see something that you spent this much money on and you were really excited about at first, just basically like go to shit kind of.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't really, I mean, it's just visually it changes. I don't know if it goes to shit, but yeah, for some people, that's their psychology. It's like, oh God, and I think of all the time, like I was super psyched on like Hamon forever because I was getting the kind of steel that would do it well. Now it makes I find that quality of, steel. I'm sure it's out there, but, and it's just like as an artist, we all change, like I'm kind of weary of polishing blades. And also the fact with what we're talking about is like, you got this beautiful Hamon. And then eventually it's always there, it'll always show up, but it's not going to be the same. It's going to change. You're going to clean it. It's going to patina.
Yeah.
And it's just, I don't know, it is the kind of funny side of this is that, most, like I would say 90+% of our work sells a picture on a computer screen. So we want them to be aesthetically pleasing, but then they also have to be really functional. I mean, as well as I do, nothing sells slower than like a satin finished stainless steel blade with like a wooden handle on it. Like it will sit there forever and people will buy it because they want something special. And so, I love the quench lines. I mean, I still really, it's kind of where my heart is because I do like that visual representation of the metallurgy.
Yeah.
And I think that it actually plays an important role in terms of the like dynamic use of a knife. I mean, I think that this is something also that doesn't get talked about a lot is that like, it's like a racing motorcycle frame. Like if it's totally rigid, you can't go around a corner on a bike like that, right? It's like knives need to have some kind of resiliency and some flex.
Right.
Distal taper is super duper important. It's another thing that I think I've seen kind of go away quite a bit in a lot of modern knife making is the trend towards super thin, ultra light, and kind of more aesthetically pleasing versus like having more distal taper and creating, the flex in whatever size knife you want to have in it. And again, it's a complex subject and it does come down to preference. But yeah, there's a lot there. I mean, I think it's I wish it were talked about more, but it is because it's a personal preference thing. I think it's something you can talk about, but it's not always relatable for everybody.
Well, yeah, and I think I think it's a good conversation to continue having, but there's never going to be a point where it's like this is the way to go. It's always going to be an amalgamation of a lot of different styles and techniques and approaches. And I think, but I guess based on the various approaches, trying to figure out how to optimize various materials for those various approaches could be maybe an interesting way for those conversations to go. Like, are you using 5160 versus RWL 34 or some sort of stainless Damascus or whatever in between? So before we get into some of the knife design, I have a ton of knives, and I think I tried to get a good mix of the various styles of knives that you've made. I'm hoping that we can kind of just go through them because
Sure.
it is quite varied, and then we can just kind of talk about the different approaches and things that you had going on in your head when you were making a particular knife.
Yeah.
But before we get into that, I did want to jump through some of the stuff, some pictures of stuff that we talked about earlier, like your work with Taigu. He's a maker. Is he based out of California?
No, he's in Arizona, right outside
Right.
he's right outside of Tucson. Yeah.
Okay. So I don't. I'm very peripherally aware of Taigu. So can you give us a little bit of background on
Yeah.
Taigu and what your relationship with him has been like over the
Yeah,
years?
it's been amazing. I was ordering a knife from him and talking to him about that, and I would, and then I was also saying I was considering learning to make knives, and I was
Mm,
thinking about going to the ABS school, and he's like, "Well, I teach. I'll teach you."
right.
And in that first conversation, on the phone with him, I asked him. I said, "Are you related to Ben Gu?" So his dad was a really famous sculptor, uh,
Oh,
like really well known, and he worked in stone and wood. And Frank Lloyd Wright owned some of his pieces in his own personal home collection.
that's
And
wild.
he's like, "Oh yeah, that was my dad." I was like, "Wow, cool." So as coming from a fine art background, I knew about his
Right.
dad, and I had known Ty's work because I had seen it. And I was impressed by the fact that he had a really full-on studio in Tucson with power hammers and like all the power equipment, ovens and everything, doing really high-end meteoritic Damascus type work.
Yeah.
And then just sort of decided to let it all go and go back to doing things really very simple hand tools,
Sure.
all by hand. And I felt like that's the person I wanted to learn from.
Mm,
And so I would go out there every year and visit for a week or so. And then I just was out there earlier this year for the first time in a little bit, but then I was going kind of every other year. But we've become really good friends. Now when we hang out, we maybe play in the studio a little bit, but we mostly just go hiking and cook food. And
talk. Yeah.
he is
That's great.
he's a master metalsmith. He's got a master's degree in fine arts. He was trained as a jeweler, and he's also a fantastic musician and just all around artist, and a really progressive thinker in a lot of ways. And people really don't know that about him. But like I
Mm,
look back at texts we have, and we have these like pretty deep philosophical texts
sure.
going back and forth about life. And we've become really good friends, and I
Yeah.
feel really blessed to know him. And he's just so talented. I mean, anyone that goes back and looks at what he's made over the years, and he's been through that transition of making the super high-end collectible stuff with all kinds of silver and gold fixturing and
Right.
meteoritic Damascus. And then he kind of got into this whole like kind of the neo-tribal thing, which was really, I don't even want to say what it was about, because it was really a thing that was a result of just getting more grounded in the essence of being a creative person, I think would probably be
Oh,
the
okay.
best way to put it, and the work
Sure.
was so different. And so it was really hard, I think, a little bit for his career because people were used to these high-end collectibles. And then now here's this stuff that looks really like super tribal and simple, but that wasn't at all energetically.
Sure.
So yeah, we've become good friends. He's been a good teacher. I learn a lot from him all the time. We talk regularly. In fact, I just looked at my phone. He just sent me a text about something. So yeah,
Oh, nice.
yeah, it's cool. We're pretty close, and I hope to get out there.
Yeah.
Once it cools down a little bit.
Yeah. It's
Yeah.
interesting. I find myself wanting to kind of digress in a way.
Hmm.
And when it comes to kind of what is the aesthetic, I guess, of the knife.
Yeah.
And just recently I did, well, it's not my first brute de forge that I've done. I've actually done kind of 3 brute de forges over the last couple of years, but this one was the most complex one that I've done because it had a compound grind of a deep hollow in it, with a convex edge. It was a mosaic Damascus. It used new tip welding, forge welding technique for Damascus that I hadn't done before. Actually, I guess in a finished piece, but at the same time, I still had to figure out how to grind it to preserve that brute de forge aesthetic and
Yeah.
forging to shape intentionally. So I was preserving as much of that forged work as I could,
Yeah.
without sacrificing the performance of the knife.
Yeah, that's like the hardest thing to do. And I think that people have seen so many Japanese knives and they're sort of accustomed to that look that,
Yeah.
there's a name of this, like, I forget exactly, Kura, starts with a K. Um,
Uh,
that
Kurouchi.
Kurouchi, yeah, that kind of finish.
Or kurochi, something.
But, you know, if you're going to do that with a convex blade geometry and want to get it thin enough to work well,
Yeah.
I mean, on the knives I've done like that, like a lot of it ends up washing way out, you know, and
Yeah.
it's a very, it's tricky, you know. It just depends on
Mhm.
how you want to do your geometry, and so I don't think people really realize that. But I hear you, and I encourage you to play with that because I'm in the same spot after all these years. Like I don't really feel like I have a ton left to prove, and so I
Sure.
want to just make a really highly functional knife. And I would like to kind of get back to a simple, highly functional knife because at the end of the day, I really want people to have something that they just feel good about using. I mean,
Yeah.
I can still make, you know, and you can still make, we can still make the art pieces, you know.
Right.
But you know, it is really to show the process, and that forging is fun and also challenging to get it right, like you're saying, to not have it
Yeah.
just fully wash out.
Yeah. All right. So another photo I want to go to is let's see. This one, you're doing a group forging. I think you said this is at an event that Taigu put on.
Yeah, he used to do these full moon parties, and it would be
Okay.
like we'd all get together and you know, we'd usually help him forge out some Damascus because this is, you know, he had no more power hammer, and so this was a piece of meteoritic Damascus that we were kind of team forging on. And this
Nice.
was quite a few years ago. Man, this is an
Yeah.
older picture, but yeah, those were fun. And a lot of his students, you know, former students and other current students would show up, and we just hang out,
Mm-hmm.
make food, and play music, and do a little forging.
Sounds rough.
Yeah, yeah, I know.
That sounds fucking awesome. I
I
want to
know
do
it is really fun. Yeah.
that. And then I got a picture of you and Abe. So this is Abe Shaw, who owns Eating Tools.
Yeah.
And I believe this is at one Blade show.
Yeah, that was
something
a
like that.
Blade. That was a little while back now. I forget which one that was, but yeah, those are always such a fun time.
Yeah, and how did you and Abe meet?
So I met
And how
Abe.
has that relationship developed over the
Yeah,
years?
I met Abe the second year of making knives through a mutual friend who many people know, Dwayne Weecom of EDC Knives, who's based out of Oakland.
Okay.
Dwayne was like a martial arts guy and kind of a ballet song specialist. And so
Okay.
Abe and Dwayne were good friends, and I had met Dwayne at the Nordic Knives show, the California or the Solvang Custom Knife Show, and Dwayne just like offered. He's like, you know, I didn't even know him. I just met him at a show, and he's like, "Well, I'm gonna have a table of Blade if you want to put some knives on my table." I had been making knives for like a year, and
Sure.
so I went to Blade in 2007 and met Abe, and Abe would kind of circulate the showroom floor as a buyer for Dwayne, and he bought one of the very first little kitchen type knives I made. I think you might have a picture of a group of knives. It's like my very first year of making. It's got a little purple handle on it. And Abe bought like the very first little kitchen knife thing I ever made. Now that's a much newer image. Yeah, I don't know if I sent that one to you or not, but yeah. So it was, you know, we just became friends. You know, and we stayed
Yeah.
friends all that time. And then when he decided to get Eating Tools going, I was one of the original makers on Eating Tools, and
You were first of the roster.
yeah, we were right in there, you know, and it was like, you know, and it's really great. We have an excellent friendship, a great business partnership,
Yeah.
and you know, it's just really cool to have something like that, you know, that's really solid. It's a rarity in the modern world to not have to have like
Sure.
contracts and paperwork and all this stuff. Like we just
Sure.
work really well together, and you know, we do what we can to keep each other alive, you know. Just like
Yeah.
keep the money coming in so we can pay bills, you know.
I think that's great that you guys developed that relationship. And I wish, honestly, that when I first started out, because I started working, selling knives through dealer,
Yeah.
and all my other knife maker friends had custom order books or they were doing direct sales, and I was like, oh, I guess that's what I want to do. I want to do all direct sales and stuff like that. And it took me literally until this is so ridiculous, like 2 or 3 years ago, before I realized, I was like, oh, the dealer that I was working with is kind of like a business partner. So instead of feeling like they're taking some of my money,
Yeah.
they're actually, it's kind of more of a partnership where they're handling some of the promotion side, some of the the sales side, some of the telling the story and getting it out there kind of side of things. And if I had a business partner that was literally like shared an office space with me, of course they would be, that was doing all that, they would be getting a portion of that sale as part of their like overall doing their part, right? It only dawned on me, and I was like, oh my God. And so part of me is like, maybe I think I need to actually get back into doing that a little bit, so that, because it does create kind of a sense of freedom when you can kind of just build whatever and send it to a dealer, like Abe or otherwise, that loves your work and loves telling people about your work, and then they can handle all the sales stuff, they get their cut, and then you get to move on.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, I mean, it was the first, 7 years of making that, because he didn't start eating tools till 10 years ago. So for me, like, but 6 years of having to sort of sell my own work, because I was doing it full time. I was a full time sculptor. I mean, I taught at the community college and did our own school, and I always had some sort of job here and there that I would quit and go back to my studio, but like, it took a lot of work. So, I mean, my hat's off to you, because you're doing it. I think Don Wen's doing it. There's a lot of people that have been very successful in promoting themselves, but it's very time consuming. I mean, it worked well for me, but I had to absolutely be blogging, and there is a California Custom Knives at Blogspot, which is a really cool history of my early years of knife making. There are a lot of posts. I thought I want to get back to that, and I may. But I had to be blogging, I had to be posting, I had to be over on the forums, like regularly posting pictures, and that all took time. But the time thing's huge, obviously, because it takes a lot of time to make a knife. And, for me, generally, I'm like, 5-6 days to make one knife. Because people always want to ask, how long does it take to make a knife? I'm like, a long time. I mean, not as long as making a stone sculpture, but, I'm glad I carved stone for 15 years before I started making knives. But, you figure a week by the time you get it all wrapped up and the sheath made and it's ready to fill out all the documentation. But there's another side to it, and it was similar to like picking a good mentor, like, I think that I got more attention in my work because Ty was my mentor. It was at a time where people, his name was still very well known. I think a lot of new people maybe don't know him because they're just new to the knife making world. And yet, I think the thing of having a purveyor that works, diligently to represent your work is like having an advocate. Somebody saying like, this guy's work is worthy of me, like, promoting it and selling it, which is different than just, I'm flying my freak flag, here I am, like, here, buy my stuff. It's different, it's harder, to do it that way. Not that it can't be done, but it definitely takes work. So I mean, it's nice to have that. And then ideally, I mean, the thing is there's more now, but for a long time there just weren't that many purveyors that really could talk chef knife well. They, because it's an education. Every show you go to, you spend more time people like educating people about sort of what they're even looking at. Like, I had the old saying, familiarity breeds contempt. Like, that was what really came into my mind at knife shows, because I watch a guy buy like I remember one show specifically, and Scott Sabi, what an amazing maker, he and his wife, she engraving on his work. So, this guy buys a like $8,000 Sabi knife engraved by his wife on the table next to me at the Southern California show, and then he looked at like an $800 knife on my table. He's like, why is it so expensive? And I'm like, dude, you just bought like a high-end collectible you're just gonna like show your friends and never use, and like you could use this every day. And it was just one of those things. Is I think when it comes to like kitchen cutlery and chef knives, I think it has changed to a fair degree now. But for a long time in those early years, it was kind of like people think of a chef knife, they think of like the knife they bought at Macy's in 1972 for $64 that they still have. And so they were like, well, why would I buy $1,000 chef knife? And I would tell people, you don't need $1,000 chef knife to cook. Like, you really don't. Like, you can go, even friends of mine, they're like, I want one of your knives, but I don't have the money. I'm like, well, let me help you find a rad vintage, like, Sabatier or like Henkel or Wusthof that was made in like the 1930s that nobody ever used it. Like, there's guys on eBay that have them. I'm like,
that was a hard one at shows for me too. And I got it not just every show, but multiple times every show.
It's
Why
tough.
is it so expensive? Isn't it just a kitchen knife? And it goes back to that familiarity breeds contempt. I think it's culinary knives are so ubiquitous to our day to day that they don't hold that kind of special place like a Tonto or a Bowie knife or
Yeah,
folder knife or all these other kind of knives that basically never get used
yeah,
or are never actually seen in person. But because we see and use a culinary knife of some sort, whether it's a paring knife all the way up to a giant chef's knife,
yeah.
whatever, or anything in between, we see and use those every day. So they don't hold that special place. But it has taken time, but I think we've finally started to connect with the
I
people
think so.
who
Yeah,
have that appreciation
yeah,
for the
and
work
it's
that goes into building that
yeah,
tool.
and you're doing it here. I mean, having the Artisans of Steel, doing the calendar and getting more people
Yeah,
interviewed, and the purveyors that are more visible, and it was the best thing about becoming a part of this community.
sure.
Was so different than the art world. I mean, geez, you want to talk about trying to like sell artwork? Forget it. I won't even have that conversation because I was in it for almost 20 years, and it wasn't until I owned my own school and my own gallery that I finally sold a bunch of work.
Mm,
Because I remember those early years, as a knife maker, and I think it was at the USN show, and one of my first shows I did there, and it wasn't really the early years, but it was when I was getting more visible, and
yeah,
and I'm kind of a pretty like clear person. I kind of wear my heart on my sleeve a little bit, and
sure.
I was so dejected at the end of this show. I didn't sell a single knife, and I remember
Oh,
it was Tom Mayo that came up to me, and he was like, "Hey," because we had met and we sort of vibed, and he's a good
yeah.
dude. He came up to me at the end of the show, and he's like, "Hey, man," he's like, "Don't even trip." He's like, "Just do your shit, keep doing what you do, and your collector base will grow." And that really meant a lot to me,
Mm,
that Tom came up to me. Somebody that's like, maybe made like a couple chef knives in his life, right? I mean, he's
right.
got his thing, right? I mean,
Yeah.
Tom did it, and it really meant a lot coming from him because here's a dude that's been like drilling holes in the handles of his knives forever, right? And they're beautiful and they're amazing knives, and he's a super cool person as a human being. And like he came up to me, and that meant more coming from him than it might from anybody else because he really stayed true to his thing. And
Yeah,
he's still doing it. And he's like probably one of the most highly collectible folding makers out there today.
for sure. All right. You ready to talk about some knife design aspects?
Sure.
All
Yeah.
right, let's start with this piece right here. This kind of has some of that gaucho look that we were talking about before. Um, please go ahead.
Yeah, so that was super fun. That was a demo I did teaching these young high school kids up at Coast Union up in Cambria. They had been doing stock reduction when I showed up, and they were going to go do a class on forging down in Los Angeles, and they were going to be forging at a round bar. And so
Okay.
I needed to do a demo for them to show them like sort of what the possibilities are with round bar. And this is actually the first time that I like forged out an integral with like a rectangular bolster and then decided to carve like a round sort of finial into it, which at
Sure.
first I was like, oh man, that's really going to look horrible. But it came out pretty sweet. And I liked that knife a lot actually when I got it done. It came out. And it was that one and the integral that I made at the same time ended up going to the same collector, I think
Oh, nice.
in Sweden. Yeah, the guy bought both of them.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
And I love. I got a close up of the handle. How I feel like this is incorporating some of your stone carving technique
yeah. I mean,
and
I use it.
aesthetic into the handle.
Yeah, it's so funny, coming in from a sculpture world, I consistently use a ton of tools that don't have anything to do with knife making at all.
Sure.
I imagine that a lot of us do.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, carbide burr, sort of reminiscent to sort of what you'd see in traditional pocket knife cut, making where they would like jig the bone
Oh,
handle.
yeah. Sure.
I mean,
Sure.
totally different process, obviously, but and it serves a purpose. It gives a little bit of grip where you kind of going to wrap your fingers around the tail end of the handle, and very simple shape. I mean, integrals are challenging in that it's like that transition from the bolster to the handle is tricky. And on this, and then the
Yeah.
last maybe few years of making them, I've been stepping the handle up like that because if you look at a lot of the original and traditional integrals that were made in production in
Right.
factories in Germany, they almost always did that, and I think it was just easier. And
Yeah.
because I want to have enough tang in there, so I don't have this little bitty tang,
Right.
but then you got to realize by the time that handle narrows down, like I don't want the handle material to be so thin that it's fragile there either. So
Sure.
yeah.
And then I just got a little bit tighter look at that bolster area.
Yeah, I mean that was a fun one. There were the little challenges along the way, and it's funny because you can go nuts trying to get that little round thing perfectly round
I
because
know.
that's
I
all
was
just
like,
carved with a file. It's not like there's no
oh wow,
there's no lathe or anything involved
right.
in
Oh,
making this.
holy
I basically
smokes,
do 2 perimeter cuts with a hacksaw blade, and then start filing and like
dude.
file that round shape in there. And I also like the integrals because like you can just see on the bottom there for my DCA
Yeah,
3 initials for my name. I can kind of tuck it away somewhere where it doesn't take away from the aesthetic of the blade.
right.
Um, you know,
That's funny.
I do two marks. I'll use my initials, and then I'll use a benchmark where I use a rotary, like basically like a carbide burr, which is like a
Sure.
rotary tool, like a Dremel for people that know what that is. It's not a Dremel, but it's a jumbo version of that. And I do that 2 circles with a strike through it, which is my version of like infinity.
Mm-hmm. Which is you can see it on some of these other pieces.
Yeah.
I guess. All right, and then this is your Saya work again,
Yeah, and then the pin is a nice simple stainless pin that I actually
right?
keened. I
Oh,
generally
nice.
fixture my handles, like if I can. If it's
Yeah.
not a stainless thing that I'm not going to try and drill through after heat treat, I will almost always pin my handles, even
Oh,
on my
nice.
stick tang knives. I don't know. I mean, I just want to build them as strong as I can.
Absolutely. All right. Here's another piece that has another beautiful Saya in it. This Saya is crazy. It almost looks like it's watercolored. It's so
Yeah,
cool.
that's cool. And that was a kind of a collaborative effort on 3 levels. It was a
Okay.
collaborative effort. So this is a knife made for the Eating Tools 10th anniversary. I did a group of full tang, and then I just did a small select group of 4, I think, enclosed tang of the personal chef model.
Hmm.
And this is again kind of looking at that thing of trying to retain that forged texture and not letting it totally wash out, but then
Right.
also pairing it with like clay and doing a clay hamon. And this is a slightly, it's 1075, so it's not as bright as some of the other hamons,
Sure.
but nevertheless, it's there. And again, it does play a role. So this is a collaboration between Greg Hansen that makes G Carta.
Oh yeah.
This was a custom layup for the 10th anniversary
Oh
tool,
wow.
Eating
I
Tools
didn't know
knives.
that.
And then
Sure.
C, who is an artist that works with Abe, chose the fabric for the Saya. So yeah, it was kind of a cool all around, sort of knitted it together with, um, 4 different people kind of putting their heads together to come up with this.
That's a beautiful piece, and I love this like the subtle activity, like wave activity of the hamon in the
Hmm.
1075. I made a series of knives a little while ago, um, that I called my Smith and Bard series, and I made it with 1075, and people were like, "Why did you make it with 1075?" And it kind of goes back to that conversation we were having about, you know, it basically wasn't fancy enough for people, and so sorry, let
Yeah,
me hop back out of
yeah.
here.
And that was
Um,
one of the full tangs. And Mike's asking about why that clay
mm,
hamon has like 2 lines on it.
okay, yeah,
And what it is, and this is the thing where I have a digital oven. I mostly really like to heat treat out of my forge because I can really see what's happening.
uh-huh.
But a lot of it is just that challenge of soaking it long enough to get all the carbon in solution so that it's tight right up to the edge of the clay. So that higher line was actually where the clay was laid out. And I will call it like a lazy hamon, right? Because had I soaked the blade maybe another it's such a fine balance because you soak
Yeah,
it too long, it'll blow past the clay. If you don't soak it long
right.
enough, then you don't get the tight definition. And
Yep.
I chose to do a bit of a lazier kind of Gunon hamon style, which is generally what I do. My
Mhm.
early trademark thing for a lot of years, I would have like a puzzle piece tip, you know.
Mhm. And I have a couple. I think I got at least one
Yeah,
example of that in here.
but yeah, I did. That's kind of why you're seeing sort of the double line on there like that.
All right, and then you said this full tang was also part of that
Yeah,
series
there
with the
were I
10,
think 3 or 4 maybe. Yeah,
and this is
4.
with Damasteel,
Yeah,
right?
there were 4
Yeah.
in Damasteel, and yeah, that wild rag micarta with like bits of rope in it, and
Yeah.
the inlay was it's called garolite. It's like a type of I think
Hmm.
it's a type of paper micarta.
I got you.
Yeah,
God, it has like this galactic, nebulous cloud kind of look to it.
yeah, that material is it's like such cool stuff. It's a kick in the pants to work with, that's for
Yeah.
sure. It's like, and then there's like bits of copper wedged in there, and
Oh yeah, yeah.
yeah, there's
I
all
see that.
kinds of crazy stuff in that handle material.
All right, this piece is a larger chef, French style chef's knife, and this has your rainbow quench
Yeah.
hamon and
Yeah, that's a big knife. That thing's like 2.25 inches wide. It's like a monster.
yeah,
And again, with some of the Greg Hansen, uh, G Carta, I was using a lot of that for quite a few years. I liked it. It was challenging to work with, but it's tough material. Yeah, and so the quench lines, and that's something that Ty was doing for many years, and still, I imagine, will do at times. And it's a type of an interrupted quench, really. It's like
sure,
he would call it like chasing the heat out of the blade. And so you'll do your initial quench, and as that heat's being pushed up towards the spine, you know, if you go slightly over the nose when you're getting up to your austenitizing temp and all the carbons in solution, and you go a little bit deeper and hold it, a little bit deeper and hold it, you can get these cool like rainbow lines
right,
in your blade. There's a couple makers out there I've talked to on Instagram that have been kind of playing with that and having some good success with it. You know, I mean, it's certainly nothing that I take any ownership of as far as like a thing. If you know Ty was doing it, and I imagine
sure,
there's other people that did it before Ty. But it is
yeah,
fun. It's not a controllable thing either. I mean, I had a guy that was like, "Oh, I want a rainbow quench on a paring knife," because trying to do it on a
oh
little,
geez,
really a wide knife, it's easy because you got all this like this
yeah,
time
you got this,
to do it.
yeah,
But it's like,
real
and I
estate
was
for
able
it.
to pull it off on the guy's paring knife, but it wasn't. I got like a couple lines, but trying to get like
Hmm.
4 or 5 lines or 6 lines is tricky.
Yeah, I believe it. Let's see. All right, let's go to this next one. So this is another rainbow quench, and so to take a step back, I know you don't claim ownership of originating that technique, but I haven't seen examples that really, I guess, speak to me or draw me in like the ones that I've seen you do in your work.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely worked on it. This is kind of like a medium Kiritsuke model.
Hmm.
This is what I was talking about, where some of even my own edge sort of belly profiles were getting a little more shallow than I would like, but there's still enough. There's more belly there than you think. But yeah, I mean, I
Sure.
really worked at like actually trying to do rainbow quenches. It's like, can I have the control in the quench to like put that blade in the quench medium and then go a little deeper and then go a little deeper and go a little deeper,
Yeah.
all with like making sure you got your heats just right and so on. And when it comes out really sweet, I mean, it really is boss. I mean, it looks so cool. Like this one's a particularly nice one. And then polishing it and doing all the attributes to get it to come out, and the etching and
Yeah.
polishing is a whole other process. But yeah,
I was gonna say polishing in that probably has to be
yeah, I mean,
a bit challenging.
yeah, it is. It's kind of sort of have to be a little bit selective, and
Right.
that particular steel, I was having the most success with that. I wish I had just bought all of it at the time because I only have a little teeny bit of it left. But
Was that like 1095
it was a
or?
low manganese 1095.
Oh, nice. Okay.
Oddly enough, but it worked really great. So I'm sure there's stuff out there I can do it with. I just,
And then in this picture on the spine of the blade, it's because of the background, it's somewhat difficult to see, but you do play with the spine portion of the profile a little bit, where it dips in at some of those darker lines of the hamon.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, that's part of the thing with this is to like quench it at a spot where it's hitting at those transition points. And
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, sometimes it's just lucky too, but yeah, I mean, it was intentionally like, I want that line to arrive right where the sort of Kisaki is going to break. And then at the top where that third flat plane is going to be too.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, some of them come out, when they come out right, they come out right. But again, it's not one of those things that, I mean, if anyone wants to play with it, I encourage you to. But like, if you don't get it like to look like that, don't worry, because it's like there is a bit of happenstance involved.
Yeah, for sure.
I
Well,
wish.
and something I like, and we'll see more examples of it in some of these pictures, but something I like that you do, and I think I mentioned this earlier, is that by understanding, having a solid, like a very good and solid understanding and foundation of how that tool is supposed to be used, that
Yeah,
creates a framework within which you can experiment with the profile and play with the profile some.
yeah.
And you do that really well. And I think, especially with a lot of these hamon knives, or these rainbow quench knives, where it it's complementary to the activity or the hormone that's happening in the blade, but it does, and it makes a unique profile, but it doesn't take away from the performance and the aesthetic, the overall aesthetic.
Yeah, no.
I feel like I see some makers doing things just to like, they're like throwing shit at the wall and see what sticks, or trying to just, they're trying to figure out how to make their work stand apart. And so part of that is like, well, let's just make a really outrageous profile. And
Yeah.
sometimes it works like for the overall look and stuff, but sometimes it just looks like, I don't know, it looks like a mess. And
It's a
and
tough
I
thing to
understand what
do.
they're trying to do, but at the same time, like, it's not necessarily working in that, especially in that particular
Yeah, I
piece,
mean,
whatever
that's
it's
why I
doing.
really recommend it. I think if any makers are feeling like they are sort of wanting to explore uh, just their own design ideas, is like, man, just start finding great resources to look at vintage knives and just start
Yeah,
looking at a lot of stuff because you'd be surprised. There's a lot of wild stuff that was made. I mean, these guys were creative people in these factories back in the 1930s and
sure.
40s and even in the 1800s. I mean, creativity is not like a new invention. So, like, these guys were making knives day in and day out, and there were sometimes they were like, "I'm going to make this thing funky, or I'm going to grind it." I mean, there was, even if it was steam powered or water powered or belt powered. I mean, I hardly. That's the other thing that's funny is like I rarely ever see a vintage knife that doesn't have like belt marks on it. Like they didn't sand those knives out. Like I have
Yeah,
almost every
that's actually a good
vintage
point.
knife I have. It's like they were still using machinery because they were like not doing it like what we're doing. I mean, we're using it too, but we're like just one person like making it mostly by hand. I mean, it was all handmade, but yeah.
Right.
So I think looking at a lot of like vintage cutlery from I think more like European cutlery. There's a lot of kind of stuff out there, but it is challenging because there really isn't all that much you can do with the profile. I mean, there's a certain amount, but I mean, it's still got to work, and then the weight characteristics, where the weight arrives at different parts of the blade, depending on what the knife's going to be used for. I mean, there's a lot to it, and oftentimes simple is best. I mean, when I think of my work, I think I actually don't do really complex builds. I mean, it's like some of the Alsace sort of inspired pieces I've been doing in the last number of years. I was finishing one of those, and I thought this is more like a little Brancusi sculpture because it's so
Mm,
hard to do and it's so challenging to get it right. But it's also super simple at the same time. So
sure.
it goes back to that same saying about being familiar. It's like a familiar thing, but I don't think people realize like to get something that's really cleanly simple right is like it's a thing.
Yeah,
But yeah, coming up with new designs for me is not particularly difficult personally, just because I've had an artistic background and a chef background. But I think the sky's the limit. I think there's a lot of room for new innovation and new looks. But yeah, I think like you were saying earlier, kind of creating a look that's indicative to your work, so people can look at it and be like, "Oh, I know whose work that is." Which if there's any new people or wannabe makers that are out there, I would say, no knock against everyone that's doing it, but there's a lot of room for more simple and simple chef knives.
sure.
Like, I guess even though it's what you do, is like I wouldn't say like all of these younger people should be encouraged to feel like they have to like make Damascus knives or make integral Damascus knives because like that's a
Sure.
stretch, like that's a highly technical thing. And I was really impressed at that show to see how many new makers were doing it and doing it really well. It
Yeah.
was kind of like at the Travis Wirtz Hammer, and I gave a small demo on. Talked a couple things about forge design, and then I did one about forging a chef knife. And I just asked for a raise of hands of how many people are new and like aren't making knives but want to make knives. And it was like probably like 18 or 20 people raise their hands like, we want to learn to make knives. And I was like, well, how many of you think you have to have all this equipment? And only like 5 of those hands went down. Like, all these people think you have to have all this equipment.
Oh yeah.
You really don't. I mean,
Sure.
it's impressive to go to the Wirtz shop because it's like a serious manufacturing facility as well.
Right.
But that you can make a coffee can forge and buy a $18 Harbor Freight weed burner, and honestly, it works phenomenally well. In fact, when Ty and I went there, we did this little demo of a bush bug. It's like a little blacksmith knife forged out of a 1-inch square 1084, and Travis had this big ribbon burner forge, and we show up with this coffee can forge running off a weed burner, and people are looking at us like we're hobos. They're like, what are you guys doing? We're like, well, because this little tiny forge is going to heat up that steel faster than that humongous ribbon burner because it's like tighter atmosphere and it's just more efficient.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's a lot to it.
That's super fun. All right. This is one that's got a hamon, like that puzzle piece I think you were talking about earlier, at the out towards the tip kind of look. And again, this is like to get that kind of contrast in the edge is so cool.
Yeah, that was, and so it was a guy named Dan Fan of Steel. I don't know how many people know him, but he's a tremendously talented maker, a swordsmith. And it was back when we had our California hammer in, and I got to know him, and I was talking to him about hamon because, you know, if anyone's really into hamon, it's the swordsmiths, right?
Sure.
And, you know, I was talking about all these beautiful wispy hamons you see on some of these knives, you know, where it's just wild and it's just really alluring and it sucks you in. And he's like, yeah, that's cool, but can you repeat it? So he, you know, was really about this thing of like repeatability of hamon, because in the swordsmithing world, that was sort of like the maker's trademark, right?
Oh, right.
They would have like a hamon would be like the one guy in that one series did like the clove blossom, right?
Oh,
Like,
yeah,
that
sure.
was his pattern. So I was like, well, I'm going to come up with like a pattern that's my pattern. And mine was certainly nothing groundbreaking, but I would do like that little puzzle piece end that would sort of dip down and round and go into like a simple Gunon hamon of various wavelengths, so to speak.
Yeah.
And like this blade, and I've got other pictures. I don't think I sent them to you, where I would always do two knives at the same time for two reasons: to see how closely I could forge the two blades alike, and then lay up the clay, and then how if I could get those hamons to match. So I was really chasing this whole art of hamon and getting to a place where I could get exactly what I wanted, which is not easy. It's really tough, to the point where like I don't think I'm really doing a whole lot of it anymore. I did it for like 8 or 9 years, and I'm like, I think I'm kind of good with hamon.
I'm good.
I mean,
I did that.
It's like I said, I proved to myself I could do it enough over all those years, and I'm like, okay, like uncle, you know, because it really is one of those things. Because at the end of the day, it's like it's beautiful, but it is kind of a functional thing in the sword world, and a little bit with chef knives, but it is an aesthetic thing, and it's kind of like when you feel like you're chasing after this purely aesthetic thing, and when it doesn't go right, you feel like you're just like a step away from the mental hospital. You got all this time in it, and you're like, oh man, I really like I didn't get it, and it was just this one attribute. It's kind of like, man, like how much do you want to suffer? And I've seen interviews with sword makers. There was one guy that was like his specialty was like the clayless hamon, right? All about thermodynamics. Like I'm going to quench my sword so that I get these badass hamons with no clay at all. And he said the same thing. He's like, I just think like I must be crazy, you know, because he's just like, I suffer for this in a really horrible way. But you know, it's like the artistic reality. You know, we do things because we want to see if we can. You know.
I get Mike saying that in Japanese sword tradition, I think, that there's a type of hamon called the boshi, which is called the hat. That has a similar look to that.
Yep. Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah.
There's so much out there on it. There's a couple cool websites that has a whole like roster of hamon forums. So like for if anyone wants to find the traditional names, and I'll send you that link. So when you do your final editing and stuff, you can maybe include it in there, because it's good for people to see. I mean, you know, I used to have more of the nomenclature in my head, but less so now. But
no worries.
There's a lot there, and my thing is like I hope anyone can find steel of the quality that you can do it anymore, because like I was saying earlier, 1095 is in the dumper. I can't find any 1095 worth buying, and this has been leading up for 6-7 years now. So I tried it again recently, and it just had all these failures. I lost like a month's worth of work and bad batches. It's not even say bad batch. It's just that there's no standard of production that's going to say that it's going to not have like the, you know, the carbon content is just like all over in the bar. Like one knife came out great. Like 4 more came out totally variable. I would have these little floaters down at the edge where it didn't harden, and I'm like,
oh, weird,
not acceptable. So now I have time, you know, invested in those pieces, and I got to scrap them and start over. You know, I was up for that 10 years ago because I was younger, but like to have that much go down the tubes and be like, oh, I'm just going to rally and do it all over. I'm like, oh, I think I'd rather go just sit on the beach and look at the wave.
No shit.
I don't want to do it all over again.
Yeah.
But you know, when it's an order and you have to, you got to do it. So it's tricky. The world has changed a bit. I mean, not to say that the steel isn't out there. I mean, if some of the Japanese steels are still going to do it. Yeah, what Mike just said. Yeah, the 25C3 is supposedly pretty awesome, and so yeah, I mean, it's going to be going back towards more of the hyper-eutectoid steels and making sure that I can get things that are, you know, just more consistently manufactured. You know.
Yeah. This is another piece I really like, and it's got kind of a flat charcoal gray kind of finish to it. I really love the compression curls in this material.
Yeah, that stuff is amazing.
And yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, that's there's only really one place that I know that's making wood of that quality, and it's almost impossible. They did actually not impossible. They sell it on their website. It's expensive.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's Nicholas Woods, and they used to sell it all the time. And things change. I think it's his grandson, Misha, is running the company now.
Oh, okay.
And that's one of the first times I kind of did something a little bit different with the blade finish. I just did like a light like ferric etch on the 52-100.
Sure.
Just because I needed to calm it down because I really wanted the handle to kind of pop a little bit more. And this is also the first time I did. I've been doing these kind of like little apartment sets, you know, which are sort of small compressed knives that were born out of the fact that when I was out in the desert where we did the school, I was living in a 400 square foot home, and you know, when you're living in small spaces, it's like you need smaller knives because I only had enough room to prep food was the cutting board, right? So I needed a knife that I could have all the veggies cut on the cutting board and still have room to put the knife down. Right. So I've been doing some apartment type sets. This was the first one that was kind of a French knife inspired apartment set, and yeah, it came out really sweet.
And then the saya, I think, is very cool. The way that they stack on top of each other.
Yeah,
it's really beautiful and complementary.
Yeah, I've done those a couple different ways. I did it where I actually glued the two sides together, but here I made it so you can separate them. So if you wanted to just the paring knife, you could, or you could keep them lashed together, and that's how I will do them from now on when I do like sets like that.
Sure.
Yeah.
Super cool. This is a goofy picture of the three of us, Abe, you, and me, at the first Blade show where we met each other. I think again that was 2014 or something like that.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, that was a good show. That was fun.
I was trying to exacerbate the height of you guys by kind of leaning back a little bit, but you guys are extremely tall compared to me.
Yeah, that's always such a fun show. I got to get back there. I might just go next year just to visit and see everybody. I miss seeing all my friends at shows, you know.
Yeah. This next piece is probably one of my favorites I've seen from you. And again, it's very simple, but I love the way the polish on that hamon came out, the look of the various rays from the rainbow quench, how the saya complements the color scheme and the handle. Again, that's that G-Carta.
Yeah.
And it looks overall like a nice little, like maybe 7.5 inch, like petty.
Yeah, I think it was a little bit bigger. No, this is a full size knife. I think this was this is about 8.5, 8.25.
Oh, well, fuck, that's perfect.
Yeah, it's a full size knife. It's probably about 1 3/4, maybe a little wider than that.
Okay.
With the heel, yeah, it's that was a really cool, and I liked that one. And that was one of my more favorite materials to use in the G-Carta too, because it was just, I don't know, it's just the lighter colors.
The maze, I think they called it the maze, right?
Yeah, I think it was called Bel Air.
Oh, Bel Air.
Yeah, and he said, he's like, oh man, no one was really using that until you started using it. I was like, well, you just gotta use it in the right way, I guess. But
nice.
Yeah, it was cool. I had these cool mosaic pins that had little blue pieces in that really beautiful Westinghouse blue that I didn't have the heart to cut anymore up into inlay because it's like super rare.
Yeah. Well, and then something else that you got going on here, not only do you have that little, very subtle little step in the spine, which I love, such a cool little detail, but I think something that's smart that you did, and again, this goes back to understanding how the tool is used, is that even though it's only 1.25 inches tall at the heel, because of the relationship of the spine to the cutting edge, you still have plenty of knuckle clearance on that knife. Even though it's kind of a narrow knife.
Yeah, it's not as narrow as it looks. You know, I generally, my handles sometimes are a little on the large-ish side, not overly, but
sure.
But yeah, I mean, and I like that little step. That's something I'm doing more lately, just because I don't know. I like the look of it. It kind of
Yeah,
creates a little bit of a different look. And then I also point out that at the heel of my knife, it's interesting in a lot of Japan, because this is kind of predicated sort of loosely on Japanese design as far
sure.
as like a stick tang type knife. And I still put a machi in, which is those little steps that you see sticking out of a lot of Japanese handles because
Oh
they
yeah,
generally don't fixture theirs. Mine registers into the handle, and I like to have the energy of that heel really kind of right below the front of the handle because I think they
sure.
perform better that way. But for that reason, I also always turn my heel in just a touch so that when you go to pick the knife up, you don't have a 90-degree edge that'll just possibly bite your finger when you go to pick your knife up, which I think is really important. I'm glad to see more makers doing that
Yeah.
because I will tell you, it is a cut that you do not want to get. You don't
Oh god.
realize the kind of energy you're using. It's not like you're
Yeah.
grabbing the knife, but you don't realize when you're picking up a knife, like the kind of energy your hand is moving. And when you hit your fingertip on that 90-degree heel, it's a crappy cut, and it's like right in the part of your finger where if you're in a commercial kitchen, you got to be using your hand all day long and
Right.
taking stuff up. So I do that on a lot of my knives.
Yeah.
I'll definitely do that. But yeah, this was a fun one. This one
Yeah.
went to a guy also overseas in Sweden.
I almost actually on that knife I took the blade show with me this year. I almost did a little step down just like that, just a little subtle thing. But because of the way the pattern worked in the blade, I almost did it. But then I decided against it because I was like, do I? Because part of the reason I forged the knife so close to finished dimension was that I was trying to preserve as much of that forged aesthetic, especially including along the spine.
Yeah,
And I was like, damn it! But then I'm gonna be cutting away some of that forge texture along the
yeah,
spine. So I ultimately decided against it. But I think in the future I will do it because, especially if it complements the pattern. But I was looking at the knife and I was like, just the way the pattern flows. I was like, God, that looks like there's a natural step there. And like looking down the side, like the profile of the knife and everything, I was like, God, that looks fucking cool.
yeah.
But I decided against it. But
That's the fun thing about forging is, you can kind of compose while the steel's hot and play with it and change it and push it around to some degree. And, it's good to have a fair idea of
mhm,
where you're headed. But I really think that stock reduction in some ways is a lot more challenging because you have to be a really good designer.
right,
Like if you're going
sure,
to do strictly stock reduction work, even more important for people to start spending some time like studying vintage knives, and I don't mean just look at pictures of them, like buy them. Like I mean
right,
I in the first like 10, 12 years, and yeah, even for 10 years before that I was buying knives, but I mean really in the first 10 years of making knives I had it budgeted into my budget every year for like $1,000 or $1,200 just to buy vintage knives to study them, and I would
oh wow,
get them in my hand and hold them and use them and like whatever, and hang on them for a while. Some I still have. Most of them over the years, I've certain ones I've kept, other ones I've given to friends, or I'll resell them
right,
on eBay or something. But it's like studying them doesn't mean just looking at a picture. You have no idea what's going on with a knife in a picture. Mine or
yeah,
anybody else's, like you have to pick them up and feel what they're like and see how they work and check what are they doing with their edge geometry. So I would encourage, especially people, anyone that's making it's worth doing. I mean, you don't have to go crazy about it, but if you see something you like, buy it and check it out. But
yeah,
yeah, stock reduction makers, there I think it's more challenging because the design's just got to be right on. I mean, you can grind it a little bit and tweak it, but
yeah.
you ideally want to start out with something that's going to work really well.
Mike jumped in on that last one. He says,
Yeah,
"Damn you, my
she
wife
wants one.
wants to order one like that now."
I know. I wanted to keep that one when I finished it. I was like, oh man,
I
this is
believe
cool.
it, dude. If I had that knife, I would be like,
It's hard.
shit.
It's
I
always
want
tough
to
when you
keep
finish
this
one. You're like,
one.
oh, I don't really want to get rid of this one.
Yeah, and part of like the maker's part of me is like, I'll just make another one, but I never do.
But then you just
I never do.
took me 6 years to finally make one to keep, and I
Yeah,
still have it.
sure.
And like, I've got one in my shop that it's not all put together yet, but if I ever finish putting it together, I use the tang and the blade for those Alsace builds as almost like a template,
Hmm,
but I'll probably keep that one if I ever put it totally together. But
I get you. All right, this I have let's see. I think we got about maybe 10 more minutes
mhm.
and I got a jam and I think you got stuff you got going on today. But I do want to share this last piece. There's a bunch more that we just ran out of time for pictures, but um if anybody wants to see more of Don's work, you can either go to his Instagram, which is I believe it's California_custom_knives, correct?
Yeah, yeah.
And then you also have a website. Is it
I've
also
also got CaliforniaCustomKnives.com, and then certainly over Eating Tools, Abe keeps everything up. And if you go to any of my knives, and you go down to my name, it's a live link, and if you click on that, you'll see everything that Abe has ever sold, which is kind of cool.
Yeah.
And actually, I need to put a link on my website to my old Blogspot site because that's kind of
You
a
should
fun.
do that.
Yeah, I don't know why I
sure.
don't have that on there. I just realized I don't. But
You
and
should
I may
definitely
get
do that.
back to that because that's got like a really cool history of the first probably 10 years of making on there. I was posting a lot for quite a while because I just enjoyed writing about it, and I really had to get back to that.
And then, all right, so this last knife I want to share is a cleaver that you made. And again, like, and it uses this handle wrap technique that you do. There's a full tang. It's got a hamon, but it's in the like the brute de forge kind of kuruchi kind of finish. But I love, again, you're playing with the profile to give it a unique look, but it's not just for uniqueness sake. Like, it kind of plays into the activity that's already happening, where the hamon ends at the spine, and then you kind of drop down, and then it follows out to the tip. You could see how, if that carried out to a traditional rectangular tip or rectangular tip of the knife, of the cleaver, it would look just like a regular cleaver. But having this slight, again, just playing with profiles and making those small choices that add a little bit of detail and unique look to it in a meaningful way, rather than just,
Yeah.
again.
Yeah. I mean, it's, the wrap thing came into being around more like hiding the fixturing, so a lot of it was, I didn't want to see any pins, and like the two little pins at the end, I actually just decided to put those in as sort of like an aesthetic thing. I probably would have put 3 in hindsight, but 2 is cool. And then that wrap is all impregnated with epoxy, and then it's also registered, so it's not just wrapped over. It actually goes down into the handle and into the tang, top and bottom.
Right.
So it's just more comfortable in the hand, and it holds up well over time.
I see. So rather than standing proud, they're intentional, like
I mean, it's proud just a teeny bit, but it's actually registered down in.
Very cool.
And the tip is kind of like a little bit of that step idea, which I've seen a couple of the makers pick up on, which I think is cool. And I'll tell why I did that was really about sight line. A lot of it was about like, this is a really wide cleaver, and I just wanted to create not only a unique look, but also like isolate that tip out there a little bit more, so that when you're using the tip on the cleaver, like your sight line is a little more clear in a way, because you don't have a tall, flat, straight front. You have something that actually moves out in a way that you can just sort of see and access what you're doing a little bit more with the tip itself on a knife that's generally going to be more for like a lot of vertical cuts, or this is my kind of take on a very modern like Chinese cleaver.
The vegetable cleaver, right?
Yeah, like a vegetable cleaver.
Yeah, I love it. This is a really good piece. I got one more like picture of this. I think it's just a slightly closer look at the blade. You can see the maker mark, as well as how that handle wrap kind of keys in to the handle material. And this is a great piece. I love that.
That's really that was a fun one. Yeah, Ty's been getting into making a lot of traditional Victorian type inspired meat cleavers lately. And
interesting.
He found this one. I forgot. I didn't totally forget that I made it, but he found it. He's like, "What the heck?" He's like, "This is the coolest cleaver I've ever seen." It was nice when your teacher likes your work.
Hell yeah, that's perfect. Right on, man. Well, I can't thank you enough for coming in and joining me in this conversation. I feel like it's been really great to kind of get your kind of just kind of like your take and the philosophy around the way you design and make your knives, and why they take the shapes and forms they do, and what is informing those designs and everything. And I think there's a lot of good wisdom that people can take from this, and hopefully some good resources that people can find, especially through literature or books, that will help them to better understand how these tools work, so they can basically make better culinary knives, if that's the style of knife they're making, of course. But honestly, I think in general, if whether it's a hunting knife, skinning knife, a camp knife, like I think understanding how those various tools work is really important to making a higher quality and higher performing tool.
Yeah.
And so,
For
yeah,
sure.
and it's been really awesome getting to know you better. Like I said, we know each other. We first met back in 2014, 15. I'm sorry, my brain doesn't work very well these days, but I don't remember when exactly. But we've known each other for a while, and we message every once in a while. We saw each other last year at the Sacramento show for the first time in probably like 4 or 5 years.
Yeah.
And it was really great to connect you then, and it's awesome to follow up with a kind of a deeper conversation. I feel like you're the kind of guy that I could get on the phone with and talk to for like hours, just about not just knives, but just like life philosophy and all the kind of stuff that we obviously didn't get into here. But there's, I think there's plenty of quality conversations to come between us in the future. So I appreciate you getting in here, my friend.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, and we'll do it again.
Absolutely, my pleasure.
Right.
I want to give one last shout out to all the super sponsors again, to support the show, to support the Patreon that makes this show possible, as well as the Patreon possible. Go to Malmasi Fire Arts on Instagram. In my Linktree link, it shows you how to get to the Patreon. You can support there. Or you can just go and Google Malmasi Fire Arts or Marco Malmasi and Patreon, and it should come up right away. But the super sponsors this month are Eric Kidwell at District 202 LLC, Josh Weston, who is Josh A. Weston, as well as the Dragon Forge Experience, that's Dragon Forge EXP on Instagram, Michael Poor, who's been here and part of the conversation throughout. I think he actually probably chimed in again one more time saying thank you for the conversation. He's Red Dragon Forge on Instagram. Russell Tinsley, who is Can't Make Knives, as well as Ouzel Finch Beers on Instagram. Dan Hubbs at 66 Mountain Knives on Instagram and Facebook. Lawrence Lake, who is Maritime Knife Supply on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and you can go find knife making supplies at maritimenifesupply.com. Ben Butcher, who is Amo Bladesmithing on Instagram. Gabe Fletcher, who is Anchorage Brewing and Anchorage Forge on Instagram, and Tony Sasma, TNT Forge on Instagram. Thank you all for your, those are all our super sponsors. And again, I can't thank Don enough, as well as the rest of the Patreon supporters, to help make this podcast possible. It really means a lot. And it's great because we get to have conversations like this, and we get to, I felt like I got a lot of good information. I'm very interested in trying, like playing with like the rainbow quench and some of these other techniques, like, and taking chances with, playing with some of the spine profile of the knife and all that kind of stuff. I've admired your work for a long time, and I really appreciate you coming in and sharing some of your knowledge and wisdom and understanding from the last 17 years of making, as well as, deeper from all your other sculpture work and whatnot.
Beautiful. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm glad we got to connect.
Absolutely, brother. All right, everybody. Thank you so much. And we'll see you or talk to you again next time.
All right. Bye-bye. Take care, everybody.